Hello, friends. Welcome to the Sleep Aliens. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Have you ever wondered what the military is hiding from you? What lies behind those censored documents and classified files? Let me take you back to 1961, to a frozen desert where the impossible became reality. What I'm about to tell you is not science fiction. These are declassified files, the real testimonies of people who witnessed something that defied the laws of physics as we know them. Believe me, what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about the Cold War. In February, the Arctic Circle is like a frozen version of hell. Temperatures drop to minus 50 degrees, wind speeds reach 110 kilometers per hour, and the sun hides itself for months. This is a place where nature clearly wants to kill you, where every breath you take feels like swallowing glass shards. In the middle of this frozen nightmare stood the highly secret Delta 7 radar station, where 12 brave souls carried out their mission of monitoring Soviet bomber aircraft. Colonel Arthur Briggs had seen his share of action during World War II and Korea. He was a no-nonsense military man, the kind who didn't believe in ghost stories or UFOs. To him, everything had an explanation, whether it was enemy aircraft, weather balloons, or equipment malfunctions. He'd been commanding Delta 7 for 18 months, and in all that time, the most exciting thing he'd encountered was a polar bear trying to break into the supply shed. That was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. Dr. Sylvia Marsh was different. She'd been assigned to Delta 7 3 months earlier as a scientific advisor, part of a new initiative to place civilian experts at military installations. With a doctorate in astrophysics from Cambridge and a sharp mind that could tear apart any theory, she approached everything with calculated skepticism. But she was also open to possibilities that Colonel Briggs would dismiss without a second thought. The two had developed a professional respect, though they rarely agreed on anything. That dynamic was about to be tested beyond measure. February 23rd started like any other day at Delta 7, which meant it was miserable. The sun hadn't risen in weeks, leaving the station bathed in perpetual twilight. The radar operators worked their shifts in the dimly lit control room, monitoring screens that showed nothing but empty sky and occasional interference from solar activity. The hum of generators provided a constant soundtrack to life at the station, a mechanical heartbeat that never stopped. Outside, the wind screamed across the tundra, rattling the reinforced windows and reminding everyone that nature was always waiting to reclaim this tiny outpost of civilization. At 1400 hours, Sergeant Michael Rodriguez was manning the primary radar console when something caught his attention. It wasn't much at first, just a small blip on the edge of the screen that could have been anything. Weather phenomena, electronic interference, a flock of birds making their way south. But Rodriguez had been doing this job for 4 years, and something about this blip felt wrong. It moved too deliberately, too smoothly. He called over his supervisor, Lieutenant James Hartford, who took one look at the screen and immediately felt his stomach drop. The blip had multiplied into 3 distinct signatures, each one moving in perfect formation at an altitude of 60,000 feet. That was well above the ceiling for any known Soviet aircraft. The MiG-21, their most advanced fighter, topped out around 57,000 feet, and even that was pushing it. These signatures were higher, moving faster, and executing maneuvers that should have been impossible. Hartford ordered Rodriguez to track them while he contacted Colonel Briggs. Briggs was in his quarters, reading through supply requisitions and wondering how he'd ended up babysitting a radar station in the middle of nowhere when the call came through. Hartford's voice had an edge to it, something Briggs recognized from combat situations. This wasn't a drill or a false alarm, something real was happening. He told Hartford he'd be there in 2 minutes and grabbed his jacket, the cold air hitting him like a physical force the moment he stepped outside. The walk from his quarters to the control room took less than 90 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The control room was buzzing with activity when Briggs entered. Rodriguez was still tracking the 3 signatures, which had maintained their formation and were now moving in a wide arc that would bring them directly over Delta 7. Dr. Marsh had been summoned as well, and she was already studying the radar data with intense focus. Her fingers moved across the calculations with practiced ease, her mind processing information at a speed that always impressed Briggs, even if he'd never admitted out loud. "Talk to me, Hartford," Briggs said, his command voice cutting through the tension. "What am I looking at?" Hartford pointed to the main display screen. 3 unidentified contacts, Colonel. Altitude 60,000 feet. Speed fluctuating between Mach 2.5 and complete stops. They've been maintaining formation for the last 12 minutes. No transponder signals, no radio communication. They're just there. Briggs studied the screen, his military training warring with his instinct that something was very wrong. Could be Soviets testing new technology. Maybe they've developed something we don't know about yet. Dr. Marsh looked up from her calculations, and Briggs could see doubt written across her face. "Colonel, the energy signatures don't match any known propulsion system. The heat output is massive, but it's not consistent with jet engines or rockets. And the acceleration patterns..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "Nothing we've built can stop mid-flight at that altitude and then accelerate to Mach 2.5 in under 3 seconds. The G-forces alone would kill any pilot." "Then give me another explanation, Doctor," Briggs said, his voice harder than he intended. He didn't like where this was going. He didn't like it at all. Before Marsh could respond, Rodriguez spoke up, his voice tight with something that sounded like fear. "Colonel, the contacts are changing course. They're heading straight for us." Everyone in the control room turned to look at the main display. The 3 signatures had broken their wide arc and were now moving in a direct line toward Station Delta 7. Their speed had increased to Mach 3, a velocity that should have been impossible at that altitude. Briggs felt his pulse quicken, old combat instincts kicking in even as his rational mind tried to find a logical explanation. "Time to intercept?" he asked, keeping his voice steady. Rodriguez did a quick calculation. "At current speed, 90 seconds. But Colonel, they're slowing down, decelerating rapidly." The room fell silent, except for the hum of equipment and the howl of wind outside. All eyes were fixed on the radar screen as the 3 signatures slowed their approach, their speed dropping from Mach 3 to subsonic in a matter of seconds. They were now hovering approximately 20 miles from the station, maintaining perfect formation at an altitude that made no sense for any known aircraft. Dr. Marsh moved closer to the screen, her scientific curiosity overriding any sense of caution. "This is incredible. The heat signatures are intensifying, but they're not moving. It's as if they're generating energy without expending it for propulsion. That shouldn't be possible according to any physics I know." Briggs was about to order his men to prepare for possible hostile action when Sergeant Rodriguez let out a sound that was half gasp, half curse. "Colonel, we've got a problem. The signatures just split. We now have 9 contacts instead of 3. The colonel felt ice water run through his veins. Whatever was out there had just demonstrated a capability that no nation on Earth possessed. These weren't Soviet bombers or experimental aircraft. These were something else entirely, something that operated by rules he didn't understand, and they were getting closer. "Get me NORAD on the secure line," Briggs ordered, his mind racing through protocols and procedures. "I want confirmation that they're seeing what we're seeing. And somebody get me visual confirmation. If these things are real, I want eyes on them. Lieutenant Hartford moved to comply, but before he could reach the communication console, every light in the control room flickered. It was just for a second, barely noticeable, but in a facility powered by redundant generators with backup systems for the backup systems, it was impossible. The lights shouldn't flicker. They couldn't flicker, but they had. Dr. Marsh noticed it too, her eyes widening with realization. "Colonel, I think they're affecting our electrical systems. The electromagnetic field they're generating must be massive." "That's impossible," Briggs said. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was wrong. Everything about this situation was impossible, yet it was happening right in front of him. The rules of reality seemed to be breaking down, and he was powerless to stop it. The 9 signatures on the radar screen began to move again, this time in a pattern that defied all tactical sense. They spread out in a perfect circle around Station Delta 7, maintaining their distance but clearly positioning themselves with purpose. It was a maneuver that suggested intelligence, coordination, and intent. They weren't just flying randomly. They were doing something specific, something planned. Rodriguez's hands were shaking as he tracked their movements. "Colonel, the formation is complete. They've surrounded us at a radius of exactly 15 miles. All contacts maintaining altitude of 60,000 feet. Heat signatures stable but intense." Briggs forced himself to think tactically, to treat this like any other military situation, even though every instinct screamed that this was different. If they wanted to attack, they'd have done it already. They're observing us, studying us maybe. "Hartford, what's the status on that NORAD connection?" Hartford looked up from the communication console, confusion and frustration evident on his face. "Sir, I can't get through. The line is dead. Not just busy or interrupted. Dead, like it doesn't exist anymore." Another flicker of lights, longer this time. The equipment in the control room hummed with a strange resonance, and Briggs could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing up. The air itself seemed charged with energy, crackling with potential that had no source he could identify. This was moving beyond the realm of mere observation. Something was about to happen, and he had no idea what. Dr. Marsh had moved to one of the auxiliary consoles and was frantically pulling up data streams. "Colonel, look at this. The magnetic readings are off the charts. We're seeing fluctuations that shouldn't be possible outside of a solar storm, but the sun's activity is normal. This is localized and it's intensifying. Whatever those things are, they're generating a field that's affecting everything electronic in a 15-mile radius." "Can we shield against it?" Briggs asked, knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "Not with anything we have here," Marsh replied, her voice betraying the first hints of fear. "This isn't just electromagnetic interference. This is something fundamental, something that's affecting the very fabric of how our equipment operates. I've never seen anything like it in all my years of research." Sergeant Rodriguez suddenly stood up from his console, his face pale in the dim light of the control room. "Colonel, the contacts are descending. All 9 of them, synchronized descent, maintaining formation. Current altitude 55,000 feet and dropping." Briggs felt his mouth go dry. They were coming down. Whatever they were, wherever they came from, they were descending toward the Station Delta 7. He had to make a decision, had to do something, but what? He had no weapons that could reach targets at 50,000 feet, no way to communicate with the outside world, and no understanding of what he was facing. "All personnel to alert status," he ordered, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. "Secure all exterior doors, prepare emergency protocols, and for God's sake, somebody get me visual confirmation of what's out there." Lieutenant Hartford grabbed a pair of high-powered binoculars and moved to the reinforced observation window. The eternal twilight of the Arctic winter provided just enough ambient light to see for miles across the frozen landscape. He scanned the sky methodically, sector by sector, looking for any sign of the 9 contacts that radar was tracking. For several long moments he saw nothing but empty sky and distant stars. Then he saw them, and his blood turned to ice. "Colonel," Hartford said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you need to see this. You all need to see this." Briggs crossed the room in 3 long strides and took the binoculars from Hartford's trembling hands. He raised them to his eyes, adjusting the focus, preparing himself for Russian bombers or experimental aircraft. What he saw instead made his entire worldview collapse in an instant. 9 lights hung in the sky like burning jewels against the darkness. They weren't aircraft, weren't anything he could name or categorize. They were perfect spheres of brilliant white light, so bright they hurt to look at even through the binoculars. Each one was identical, each one motionless despite the howling Arctic wind, and each one was descending with mechanical precision toward the frozen ground below. But that wasn't what made Briggs's hands shake. It wasn't the lights themselves that shattered his understanding of reality. It was what surrounded them. Each sphere was encased in what looked like a shell of distorted air, a shimmer that bent light and made the background stars ripple like reflections on water. The effect was hypnotic and deeply wrong, a visual representation of physics being violated in ways that shouldn't be possible. "My God," Briggs whispered, lowering the binoculars with the hands that refused to stay steady. He handed them to Dr. Marsh without a word, watching her face as she witnessed what he had just seen. Her expression cycled through disbelief, wonder, and finally a kind of terrified excitement that scientists get when confronting the truly unknown. "This changes everything," Marsh breathed, still staring through the binoculars. "This changes absolutely everything we thought we knew." Rodriguez's voice cut through their shocked silence. "Altitude now 40,000 feet and descending, and, Colonel, at this rate, they'll reach ground level in approximately 8 minutes. What are your orders?" What were his orders? Briggs had been trained for enemy attacks, equipment failures, natural disasters. He'd survived situations that would have broken lesser men, but nothing in his entire military career had prepared him for this moment. Nothing had prepared him to give orders when faced with the impossible made manifest. "Continue monitoring," he said, finally, forcing his voice to remain calm even as his worldview crumbled. "Document everything. If these things land, I want every sensor, every camera, every recording device we have capturing what happens. This needs to be preserved, studied, understood." "And if they're hostile?" Hartford asked, the question that everyone was thinking, but nobody wanted to voice. Briggs looked at his second-in-command, saw the fear and determination in the younger man's eyes, and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Then we document that too. We're witnesses now, Lieutenant. History is happening, and we're standing right in the middle of it. Whatever happens in the next few minutes, the world needs to know. Someone needs to tell the truth about what we're seeing here tonight." The lights continued their descent, and as they drew closer, the effects on the station became more pronounced. Equipment began to malfunction in ways that made no technical sense. Monitors displayed impossible readings. Communication systems emitted strange harmonics that sounded almost musical, and the very air inside the control room felt charged with an energy that made skin tingle and hair stand on end. Dr. Marsh was at the environmental sensors now, reading data that made her shake her head in disbelief. "Colonel, the temperature outside is dropping rapidly. We're down to minus 75 Fahrenheit and falling. That's 15 degrees colder than it was 5 minutes ago, and the atmospheric pressure is fluctuating in ways that shouldn't be possible without a massive weather system, which we don't have. Could they be causing it?" Briggs asked, already knowing the answer. They must be, Marsh confirmed. The energy output alone would create localized weather effects, but this is extreme. It's as if they're pulling heat energy out of the environment, using it for something. The physics are fascinating and absolutely terrifying. Rodriguez called out another update. Altitude 20,000 feet. Descent rate steady. Colonel, they're going to land within visual range of the station. We're going to have a front row seat to whatever happens next. And what about you? Have you ever been in a situation where everything you believed about reality was challenged in an instant? Where the rules you thought governed existence were revealed to be just suggestions that could be broken by forces beyond your comprehension? That's where these men and women found themselves on February 23, 1961. They were about to witness something that would change their lives forever, something that would force them to question every assumption they'd ever made about humanity's place in the universe. The 9 spheres of light continued their methodical descent, now close enough that everyone in the control room could see them without binoculars. They dominated the sky, 9 impossible suns that cast the frozen landscape in stark, unnatural illumination. The shadows they created were sharp and dark, moving in strange patterns as the lights descended, and the effect was deeply unsettling to anyone who watched. Briggs found himself thinking about his family back in Virginia, his wife and 2 daughters who had no idea what their husband and father was witnessing at this moment. He thought about the world going about its business, people working and living and dying without any knowledge that everything was about to change. Because if what he was seeing was real, if this wasn't some mass hallucination or equipment failure, then nothing would ever be the same again. Altitude 10,000 feet, Rodriguez reported, his voice mechanical now, retreating into the comfort of procedure when faced with the incomprehensible. Descent continues. No change in formation. Heat signatures intensifying. Dr. Marsh had abandoned her instruments and was now standing at the observation window, watching the spectacle with wide eyes. "They're beautiful," she whispered, and Briggs was surprised to find he agreed. Despite the fear, despite the violation of everything he thought he knew, there was an undeniable beauty to what he was witnessing. It was the beauty of the utterly alien, of something so far beyond human experience that the mind struggled to process it. The lights were close enough now that individual details became visible. The distortion field around each sphere rippled and pulsed with patterns that seemed almost organic, as if the lights themselves were breathing. Colors flickered at the edges of the distortion, spectral hues that human eyes weren't designed to see, and the effect was both mesmerizing and nauseating. 5,000 feet, Rodriguez called out. They're slowing the descent. Current rate suggests landing in approximately 2 minutes. 2 minutes. 120 seconds until the impossible became undeniable. Briggs found himself counting heartbeats, each one feeling like it might be his last in a world that made sense. He was a military man, trained to face threats and overcome obstacles, but this was beyond threat or obstacle. This was revelation, apocalypse, and first contact all rolled into one terrifying moment. The station's lights flickered again, this time staying dark for a full 3 seconds before returning. In that brief moment of darkness, the glow from the 9 descending spheres was the only illumination, casting everything in an otherworldly radiance that made the control room look like something from a fevered dream. When the lights came back on, several of the monitoring systems had shut down completely, their screens blank and lifeless. "We're losing systems," Hartford reported, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. "Backup generators are still running, but primary power is fluctuating wildly. If this keeps up, we'll be completely dark in less than 5 minutes." Briggs made a quick calculation. The lights will have landed by then. Whatever they're going to do, we'll know soon enough. Keep the emergency systems running as long as possible. I want every second of this documented. Altitude 2,000 feet, Rodriguez said, his voice nearly drowned out by a new sound that filled the control room. It was a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The frequency was so low that it was felt more than heard, a vibration that made bones ache and teeth hurt. It was the sound of massive energy being manipulated, channeled, used for purposes that human science couldn't begin to explain. Dr. Marsh pressed her hands against the observation window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the descending lights. "The distortion field is expanding," she said, her scientific training overriding her fear. "As they get closer to the ground, the field is growing larger. It must be some kind of landing mechanism, a way to cushion their descent or protect the ground from their energy output." 1,000 feet, Rodriguez called out. "Landing imminent. Colonel, should we evacuate the station?" It was a reasonable question. They were sitting in a facility filled with electronic equipment, while 9 objects of unknown origin and capability were about to land in their immediate vicinity. The sensible thing would be to get everyone away from the station, to put distance between themselves and whatever was about to happen. But Briggs knew they couldn't do that. They were witnesses to history, and history required documentation. "Negative," Briggs said firmly. "We stay and observe. But I want everyone ready to move on my command. If these things show any sign of hostility, we evacuate immediately. Hartford, make sure the emergency exit protocols are ready." The lights were now so close that their glow illuminated the interior of the control room through the windows, casting everything in brilliant white radiance. The hum had intensified to the point where speech was difficult, and several of the personnel had to cover their ears against the overwhelming sound. Equipment racks rattled, floor panels vibrated, and the very structure of Station Delta 7 seemed to resonate in harmony with whatever force the lights were generating. 500 feet, Rodriguez shouted over the noise. 400, 300. "Colonel, they're landing." This was it, the moment when everything changed. Briggs gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white with tension, and watched as 9 impossible objects settled onto the frozen Arctic tundra around Station Delta 7. The distortion fields expanded as they touched down, creating waves of visible energy that rippled across the snow-covered ground. Where the fields touched, the snow didn't melt or vaporize. It simply ceased to exist, leaving perfect circles of bare frozen earth that steamed in the Arctic cold. The landing was silent, despite the massive energy output. One moment the spheres were descending, the next they were resting on the ground in perfect formation, their brilliant glow unchanged by contact with the earth. The hum continued for several seconds after landing, then began to fade, dropping in frequency and intensity until it was barely perceptible. In its absence, the normal sounds of the Arctic returned, the howl of wind, the creak of ice, the mechanical hum of the station's struggling generators. For a long moment, nobody in the control room moved or spoke. They simply stared at the 9 lights that now surrounded their station, trying to process what they had just witnessed. It was Dr. Marsh who broke the silence, her voice shaky but determined. "Colonel, we need to study these things. We need to understand what they are, where they came from, what they want. This is the most significant scientific discovery in human history, and we have front-row seats." Briggs turned to look at her, seeing the mixture of fear and excitement in her eyes, and felt a sudden, profound responsibility. Whatever these lights were, whatever they represented, the world needed to know. But the world also needed to be protected from the panic and chaos that this knowledge might create. He had to make decisions now that could affect the entire human race, and he had less than a minute to make them. "Rodriguez, are the recording systems still functioning?" he asked. The sergeant checked his equipment. "Main systems are down, Colonel, but the backup film cameras are still operational. We're getting visual documentation at least." "Good. Keep them running. Hartford, try the communication systems again. I don't care if you can't reach NORAD. Try anyone, anywhere. The world needs to know what's happening here." As Hartford moved to comply, the lights began to change. The brilliant white radiance dimmed slightly, and the distortion field started to contract, pulling back toward the central spheres. Colors began to appear within the light itself, swirls of purple and blue and green that moved in patterns too complex for the eye to follow. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, and everyone in the control room found themselves drawn to the windows, unable to look away. Dr. Marsh was the first to notice the pattern. Her scientific mind, trained to find order in chaos, recognized that the colors weren't random. They were pulsing in sequence, each sphere responding to the others in a carefully choreographed display that suggested communication, or perhaps some form of coordination. She grabbed a notepad and began sketching the pattern, her hand moving rapidly across the paper as she tried to capture what she was witnessing. "Colonel," she said without taking her eyes off the lights, "they're communicating, or at least they're exchanging information. The color patterns are too precise to be random. There's intelligence behind this, active intelligence." Briggs felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic cold. Intelligence meant intent, and intent meant purpose. Whatever these things were, wherever they had come from, they were here for a reason. The question was whether that reason would prove beneficial or catastrophic for the 12 people trapped in Station Delta 7. "How long until we can reach someone outside this facility?" Briggs asked Hartford, keeping his voice level despite the fear gnawing at his gut. Hartford shook his head, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Still nothing, sir. It's like we don't exist anymore. Every communication channel is dead. Radio, telephone, even the emergency backup systems. We're completely isolated." Rodriguez suddenly straightened at his console, his eyes widening at something on his screen. "Colonel, the radar is picking up something new. There's movement inside the spheres. Something's happening." Everyone turned back to the windows, their hearts pounding in anticipation of what might emerge from those impossible lights. The color patterns had intensified, the swirls moving faster now, creating a hypnotic effect that made it difficult to look away. And then, as they watched, something began to materialize within each sphere. At first, it was just shadows, dark shapes moving within the brilliant light. But as the seconds passed, the shapes became more defined, more solid. They were roughly humanoid in form, but that was where any resemblance to humanity ended. The figures were tall, at least 7 feet from what Briggs could estimate, with proportions that seemed slightly wrong in ways his mind struggled to process. Their movements were fluid, almost liquid, as they emerged from the light spheres and stepped onto the frozen ground. "Jesus Christ," Hartford whispered, his voice barely audible over the collective intake of breath from everyone in the control room. "They're real. They're actually real." The figures stood motionless for several long moments, 9 entities surrounding Station Delta 7 in perfect formation, in the dim Arctic twilight. Illuminated by their own spheres of light, they appeared almost spectral, like ghosts made solid through sheer force of will. Briggs found himself counting them obsessively, as if confirming their number would somehow make the situation more manageable. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. 9 visitors from somewhere beyond human comprehension. Dr. Marsh was frantically taking notes, her scientific training overriding her fear. Their form suggests bipedal locomotion, but the proportions are all wrong for Earth-based evolution. The limbs are too long, the torso too narrow, And look at the way they move. It's not quite right. The joints bend at angles that shouldn't be possible with a skeletal structure like ours. Doctor, I don't care about their biology right now, Briggs said, his command voice returning as military training kicked in. I care about their intentions. Are they hostile? Are they here to observe? Are they going to attack? Before Marsh could respond, one of the figures moved. It was the one directly in front of the control room window, positioned as if it had chosen its location specifically to be visible to anyone inside the station. The movement was sudden and startling, a jerky motion that seemed to violate the laws of inertia. One moment it was standing still, the next it was several feet closer to the station, with no visible transition between the two positions. Did you see that? Rodriguez asked, his voice cracking with strain. It didn't walk, it just moved, like it teleported or something. Briggs had seen it too, and the impossibility of it made his head spin. He'd spent his entire life in a world governed by rules, by physics and logic and cause and effect. But those rules were being rewritten right in front of his eyes, and he was powerless to stop it. The figure moved again, this time closing the distance to the station even further. It was now less than 50 feet from the control room window, close enough that details became horrifyingly clear. The entity had no face in the traditional sense. Where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been, there was only a smooth, featureless surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The head was elongated, almost egg-shaped, tilted at an angle that would have been uncomfortable for a human but seemed natural for this being. The body was covered in something that looked like skin, but moved like liquid, shifting and flowing in response to movements that Briggs couldn't see. "It's looking at us," Marsh whispered, her voice filled with awe and terror. "It doesn't have eyes, but it's definitely looking at us. I can feel it." She was right. Despite the lack of visible sensory organs, there was an undeniable sense of being observed, studied, analyzed by an intelligence that operated on levels humans couldn't comprehend. Briggs felt exposed, as if this creature could see through walls and flesh to the very core of his being. It was the most vulnerable he'd felt since childhood, and he hated it with every fiber of his being. The figure raised what passed for an arm, the limb extending in a smooth, boneless motion that made several people in the control room gasp. The appendage ended in something that might have been a hand, though it had too many digits and they moved independently of each other in ways that defied anatomy. The gesture could have been a greeting, a threat, or something else entirely. There was no way to know, no frame of reference to interpret what they were seeing. "Colonel, what do we do?" Hartford asked, and Briggs could hear the barely controlled panic in his second-in-command's voice. "Do we try to communicate? Do we hide? Do we run?" Briggs forced himself to think tactically, to treat this like any other military situation even though nothing about it was normal. "We observe and document. That's all we can do right now. Nobody goes outside, nobody tries to make contact. We watch, we record, and we wait to see what they do next. And if they try to enter the station?" Hartford pressed. The colonel's jaw tightened. "Then we deal with that when it happens. One crisis at a time, Lieutenant." The figure outside lowered its arm and stood motionless again, as if waiting for something. Around the perimeter of the station, the other 8 entities remained in their positions, creating a perfect circle of otherworldly presence that felt both like a siege and a vigil. The lights from their spheres cast the frozen landscape in stark relief, creating a scene that looked like something from a nightmare or a fevered hallucination. Minutes passed in tense silence. The wind continued to howl outside, but inside the control room, the only sounds were the labored breathing of terrified humans and the struggling hum of electronic equipment trying to function under impossible conditions. Dr. Marsh continued taking notes, her hand moving across the page with mechanical precision, even as her mind raced to understand what she was witnessing. Rodriguez kept his eyes glued to the radar screen, tracking movements and energy signatures that made no scientific sense. Hartford stood ready at the communication console, hoping against hope that he could somehow reach the outside world and let them know what was happening. And then, without warning, every light in Station Delta 7 went out. The darkness was absolute and terrifying. The backup generators died without a sound. The emergency lights failed to activate, and even the glow from the equipment displays vanished in an instant. Outside, the 9 spheres of light provided the only illumination, casting long shadows through the windows that seemed to move and writhe with malevolent intent. The temperature inside the station began to drop immediately, the heating systems offline along with everything else. "Report!" Briggs commanded, his voice cutting through the shocked silence. "What just happened?" Rodriguez's voice came from the darkness, shaky but functional. "Everything's dead, Colonel. Total power failure across all systems. It's like something just reached out and turned off the entire station. Can you restart the generators?" Briggs asked, already knowing the answer. "I can try, sir, but I don't think it's going to work. This isn't a mechanical failure. This is something else." Dr. Marsh's voice joined the conversation, and despite the fear in her tone, there was also a note of understanding. They're doing this. The entity's outside. They've created some kind of field that's suppressing all electrical activity within the station. The power systems are fine, but they can't function because the field won't allow it. "Why?" Hartford asked. "Why cut our power?" "Maybe they want us helpless," Marsh replied. "Or maybe they need the electromagnetic environment to be quiet for some reason. Or maybe this is just a side effect of whatever they're doing out there. We have no way to know." Briggs moved toward the window by memory, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light provided by the spheres outside. The figure that had been closest to the station was still there, still standing in that unnatural pose, still radiating a sense of alien intelligence that made his skin crawl. As he watched, the entity began to change again. The smooth, featureless face started to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. Patterns emerged in the liquid surface, geometric shapes that interlocked and separated in dizzying complexity. Colors flashed across the entity's form, the same purples and blues and greens that had appeared in the light spheres, pulsing in rhythms that felt almost like language. Briggs found himself mesmerized by the display, his rational mind trying and failing to find meaning in the alien communication. "It's trying to tell us something," Marsh said, moving to stand beside him at the window. "Those patterns, they're too deliberate to be random. It's attempting communication, but we don't have the framework to understand it." "Can you decode it?" Briggs asked, grasping at any hope of understanding what was happening. Marsh shook her head. "Not without more data, more time, maybe decades of study. This is completely outside human experience, Colonel. We're not equipped to understand beings that operate on such a different level of existence." The patterns on the entity's surface intensified, the colors bleeding into each other to create hues that hurt to look at directly. And then, cutting through the silence of the dead station, a sound emerged. It started as a low hum, similar to what they'd heard during the landing, but different in quality. This sound had structure, had purpose. It rose and fell in waves, creating harmonics that resonated in the chest and made teeth ache. "Is that language?" Rodriguez called out from his darkened console. "Is it trying to talk to us?" "I don't know," Marsh admitted. "It could be language, or it could be something else entirely. Maybe they communicate through sound and light simultaneously. Maybe the patterns we're seeing and the sounds we're hearing are just fragments of a much larger message that requires senses we don't possess to fully understand." The sound changed, becoming more complex, Overtones and undertones wove together in patterns that seemed almost mathematical in their precision. Briggs felt something stirring in the back of his mind, a sense of meaning just beyond his grasp, like trying to remember a word that sits on the tip of the tongue. It was frustrating and frightening in equal measure, the sense of being on the edge of understanding something vast and important. And then, cutting through the alien symphony, came a different sound. This one was unmistakably terrestrial, unmistakably mechanical, and unmistakably close. It was the sound of metal scraping against metal, coming from somewhere within the station itself. Every head in the control room turned toward the interior door, where the sound seemed to originate. "Something's inside," Hartford said, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. "Whatever's happening outside, something got inside the station." Briggs felt his blood run cold. The entities had been outside, safely separated by walls and windows in the sanctity of the station's interior. But if one of them had found a way in, if they were no longer contained by the perimeter, then everyone in Delta 7 was in immediate danger. He moved toward the door, every sense on high alert, trying to pinpoint the location of the sound. The scraping came again, louder this time, accompanied by a grinding noise that suggested something was forcing its way through a space too small for it. The sound was coming from the direction of the equipment room, a large space filled with the generators and mechanical systems that kept the station running, or rather, that had kept it running before everything had shut down. "Rodriguez, Hartford with me," Briggs ordered. "Dr. Marsh, stay here with the rest of the crew. If anything comes through that door that isn't us, seal the control room and don't open it for anything." "Colonel, you don't know what's out there," Marsh protested. "It could be dangerous." "It could be. That's why I'm going to find out," Briggs interrupted. "We need to know what we're dealing with. Stay here. That's an order." He grabbed a heavy flashlight from the emergency supplies, testing it with little hope that it would work. To his surprise, the beam flickered to life, weak but functional. Apparently, battery-powered devices were less affected by whatever field the entities were generating. Hartford and Rodriguez grabbed their own flashlights, the 3 weak beams of light providing meager comfort against the oppressive darkness of the station. Briggs led the way out of the control room and into the corridor beyond. The hallway was pitch black except for their flashlights, the emergency lighting strips that should have activated during a power failure remaining stubbornly dark. The temperature had dropped noticeably, their breath now visible in the flashlight beams. Without heating, the Arctic cold was already invading the station, and it would only get worse. The scraping sound came again, echoing through the metal corridors in a way that made it difficult to pinpoint. Briggs moved cautiously, his free hand trailing along the wall to maintain his bearings in the darkness. Behind him, Hartford and Rodriguez followed, their flashlights casting wild shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. They reached the equipment room door, which stood slightly ajar. That was wrong. The equipment room was always kept locked for security reasons, and the door was heavy enough that it wouldn't swing open on its own. Someone or something had opened it, and that someone or something might still be inside. Briggs signaled for the others to take positions on either side of the door, then used his boot to push it fully open. The hinges creaked in protest, the sound abnormally loud in the silent station. He swept his flashlight across the interior of the equipment room, the beam catching glimpses of generators, power panels, and mechanical systems that should have been humming with activity, but now sat silent and dead. And there, in the far corner of the room, something moved. The flashlight beam caught it for just a moment before it darted away, moving with inhuman speed into the shadows beyond the light's reach. But that glimpse was enough. Briggs had seen its form, had registered the wrongness of its proportions, had felt the intelligence behind its movements. One of the entities was inside the station, and it was actively avoiding the light. "Contact," Briggs said quietly, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through his veins. "One entity in the room, far corner. It's avoiding the light. Hartford, Rodriguez, spread out and try to keep it illuminated. I want to know what it's doing in here." The three men moved into the equipment room, their flashlights sweeping across the space in coordinated patterns. For several long moments, they saw nothing but shadows and machinery. Then, Rodriguez's light caught it again, pressed against the wall near the primary power distribution panel. The entity was doing something to the panel, its two long fingers manipulating the controls with movements that were too fast and too precise to follow. "It's at the power systems," Rodriguez reported. "Colonel, I think it's the reason everything's shut down. It's doing something to our electrical grid." Briggs moved closer, keeping his flashlight trained on the entity. At this range, he could see more details. The being was smaller than the ones outside, perhaps only 6 feet tall instead of 7, but no less alien. Its skin-like covering rippled with patterns similar to what they'd seen on the figure outside, though more subdued. As his light hit it directly, the entity turned what passed for its head toward him, and despite the lack of visible eyes, Briggs felt the weight of its attention like a physical force. "Can you understand me?" Briggs asked, knowing it was probably futile but needing to try. "We mean you no harm. We just want to understand why you're here." The entity made no response, at least none that Briggs could detect. Instead, it returned its attention to the power panel, its fingers moving in patterns that created soft clicking sounds. The panel's surface began to glow with a faint bioluminescence, as if the entity's touch was activating something that had been dormant. Hartford moved to flank the entity from the other side, his flashlight creating a second beam that caught the being in crossfire. "Colonel, what are your orders? Should we try to stop it?" It was a reasonable question, but Briggs had no good answer. How did you stop something that could travel between stars, that could shut down an entire military installation with apparent ease, that moved and thought in ways that defied human understanding? Any aggressive action could be interpreted as hostility, potentially endangering everyone in the station. But allowing the entity to continue manipulating their power systems was equally dangerous. Before Briggs could make a decision, the entity did something that changed everything. It turned away from the power panel and moved toward them, not with aggression, but with what seemed almost like purpose. As it approached, the patterns on its surface began to pulse with increasing intensity, and the air around it started to shimmer with visible energy. "It's coming toward us," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Colonel, should we fall back?" "Hold your position," Briggs ordered, forcing himself to stand firm, even as every instinct screamed at him to run. "Let's see what it wants." The entity stopped approximately 10 feet away from them, close enough that they could see the minute details of its form in their flashlight beams. Up close, it was even more alien than from a distance. The liquid-like surface of its body moved constantly, shifting and flowing in response to internal currents that followed no pattern Briggs could discern. The elongated head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck, regarding them with senses that operated on levels beyond human perception. And then it spoke. The sound that emerged from the entity was nothing like human speech. It was a complex harmonic that seemed to come from everywhere at once. A symphony of frequencies that ranged from subsonic rumbles to ultrasonic whistles. The sound bypassed the ears entirely, resonating directly in the bones and skull, creating sensations that were more felt than heard. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely incomprehensible. "What is it saying?" Hartford asked, his hand still on his sidearm but making no move to draw it. "I have no idea," Briggs admitted. "But it's definitely trying to communicate. Dr. Marsh needs to hear this. Rodriguez, get back to the control room and bring her here. We need someone who might have a chance of understanding what we're dealing with." Rodriguez hesitated for just a moment, clearly reluctant to leave his commanding officer alone with the alien entity, but military discipline won out. He turned and hurried from the equipment room, his flashlight beam bouncing off the walls as he ran. The entity watched him go with that same sense of focused attention, then returned its gaze to Briggs and Hartford. The alien harmonic changed, becoming more complex. New frequencies joined the chorus, creating patterns that almost seemed to form words if you listened in just the right way. Briggs found his mind trying to make sense of it, searching for meaning in the alien sounds. And for just a moment, he thought he caught something. Not words exactly, but impressions, concepts, ideas that brushed against his consciousness like ghosts. Understanding, observation, exchange, peaceful, temporary. Were those his own thoughts, his mind trying to impose meaning on meaninglessness? Or was the entity actually communicating with him on some level beyond language? Briggs couldn't be sure, and that uncertainty was perhaps more frightening than outright hostility would have been. Dr. Marsh arrived within minutes, Rodriguez leading her into the equipment room with his flashlight. She took in the scene with wide eyes, her scientific curiosity immediately overriding her fear as she saw the entity standing before them. She moved closer, seemingly unafraid, her mind already working to analyze and understand what she was witnessing. "It's communicating," she said immediately, listening to the alien harmonic with intense focus. Not through words, but through conceptual patterns embedded in the sound frequencies. It's incredibly sophisticated, operating on multiple levels simultaneously. Most of it is beyond our ability to perceive, but there are elements we can grasp if we know how to listen. "Can you understand it?" Briggs asked hopefully. Marsh was silent for a long moment, her head tilted as she concentrated on the alien sounds. "Fragments," she said finally. "Just fragments. But I think it's trying to tell us that they're not here to harm us. They're observing, studying. We're subjects of scientific interest to them, the way we might study a newly discovered species of insect." "That's not exactly reassuring," Hartford muttered. "No, but it's better than the alternative," Marsh replied. She took a step closer to the entity, and Briggs tensed, ready to pull her back if necessary. But the entity made no threatening moves. Instead, the patterns on its surface began to mirror the rhythm of Marsh's breathing, as if it was attuning itself to her biological patterns. "It's adapting to me," Marsh whispered in awe. "Trying to find common ground for communication. This is extraordinary. Colonel, we're witnessing first contact between humanity and an extraterrestrial intelligence. Whatever happens next, this moment will define our species' future." She was right, of course. Briggs understood the magnitude of what was happening even as he struggled to process it. Every decision he made in the next few minutes could have consequences that echoed through history. The responsibility was crushing, but he couldn't afford to be paralyzed by it. He was a military commander, and commanders made decisions even when all the options were terrible. "Doctor, ask it why they shut down our power," Briggs said. "Ask it what they want from us." Marsh nodded and began to speak, her words slow and deliberate, but instead of using English, she began humming, creating harmonics that crudely mimicked the patterns the entity had been producing. It was a bold attempt at communication, and Briggs held his breath waiting to see how the entity would respond. The alien being went very still, its surface patterns freezing in mid-motion. For several heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the entity began to respond. The harmonics it produced changed, becoming simpler, more structured, as if it was trying to meet Marsh halfway. The exchange continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, a crude dialogue between species separated by millions of years of evolution. Finally, Marsh turned back to Briggs, her face pale but excited. "I think I understand. They shut down our power because they needed to examine our technology without interference. They're trying to understand how we've developed, what level of advancement we've reached. And Colonel," she paused, struggling to find words for what she was about to say, "they're not alone. This isn't just 9 visitors. Their ship, their vessel, whatever you want to call it, is in orbit above us right now. These entities are just a small survey team." The implications hit Briggs like a physical blow. A ship in orbit. Multiple entities. This wasn't a chance encounter or a random visit. This was an organized expedition, and Earth was the subject of study. The question was whether humanity was ready for the truth of its place in a universe that was far more crowded than anyone had imagined. "How long will they be here?" Briggs asked, his military mind already thinking about containment and security. Marsh asked the entity through her crude harmonic language, and the response came quickly. 23 minutes, she translated. "They'll be here for exactly 23 minutes, then they'll leave. The power will return when they depart. Colonel, they've done this before. This isn't their first visit to Earth. They've been observing us for, I can't quite understand the time frame, but a long time. Decades at least, maybe longer." "And they've never made contact before?" Hartford asked. "Why now? Why reveal themselves?" Marsh posed the question, and the entity's response was longer, more complex. She struggled to interpret it, her face contorting with concentration. "Because we've reached a critical point," she said finally. "We're on the verge of technologies that would allow us to detect them more easily. They wanted to make contact on their terms, in a controlled environment, before we stumbled onto them by accident. This is a test, Colonel. They're seeing how we'll react to the knowledge of their existence." Briggs felt the weight of that revelation settle onto his shoulders. A test. Humanity was being tested by intelligences far beyond our own, and the results of that test would determine our future relationship with whatever civilization these entities represented. No pressure, just the fate of the entire human race hanging in the balance. "And if we fail the test?" he asked quietly. The entity's response needed no translation. The harmonics it produced were tinged with something that transcended language, a universal concept that even humans could understand. Isolation. Quarantine. Humanity would be left alone, cut off from contact with the wider universe, until we either evolved beyond our current limitations or destroyed ourselves. We would be children, locked in a room for our own protection and the protection of others. "Tell them we understand," Briggs said to Marsh. "Tell them we'll keep this encounter quiet, that we'll report it through proper channels but won't cause panic. Ask them what they need from us to pass their test." Marsh translated the message, and the entity's response was surprisingly simple. Honesty. Understanding. Time. The universe was vast and patient, and humanity would find its place within it eventually. But that process couldn't be rushed, couldn't be forced. We had to grow into our role as a spacefaring species naturally, learning the hard lessons that came with maturity. The entity turned away from them then, returning to the power panel it had been examining earlier. Its fingers moved across the surface one more time, and Briggs could have sworn he saw something like satisfaction in its movements. Then, without warning, it simply vanished. One moment it was there, solid and real, and the next it was gone, as if it had never existed. The only evidence of its presence was the faint glow still emanating from the power panel, slowly fading as they watched. "Where did it go?" Rodriguez asked, his flashlight sweeping the room in search of the entity. "Back to its sphere, I imagine," Marsh said, still staring at the spot where it had disappeared. "Or directly to their ship. They clearly have technology that allows them to move in ways we don't understand. Teleportation, dimensional shifting. Who knows?" Briggs checked his watch, noting that they'd been in the equipment room for nearly 20 minutes. "We should get back to the control room. If they're leaving in 23 minutes total, we only have a few minutes left to observe them." They hurried back through the darkened corridors, their flashlights casting wild shadows that no longer seemed quite so threatening. The alien presence had been terrifying, yes, but also strangely mundane once they'd begun to communicate. Just another form of life, trying to understand its place in the universe, no different from humanity in its fundamental drives and curiosities. When they reached the control room, the rest of the crew was still at the windows, watching the 9 spheres of light that continued to surround the station. Dr. Marsh immediately went to her notes, adding everything she'd learned from the encounter in the equipment room. Briggs joined his people at the windows, watching the alien vessels and wondering what the future would hold for a species that had just learned it wasn't alone in the universe. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness. Briggs found himself watching his mechanical watch, the only timepiece still functioning in the electromagnetic dead zone that the entities had created. 21 minutes had passed since the spheres had landed. 2 minutes remained until their promised departure. 2 minutes until power would return and life at Station Delta 7 could resume some semblance of normalcy. Except nothing would ever be normal again. Not really. How could it be when you'd looked into the face of the impossible and found it staring back? The spheres began to pulse in unison, their light intensifying with each cycle. The color patterns that had seemed almost random before now revealed themselves as a countdown, a visual representation of time passing in a language that transcended words. Even without Marsh's translation, everyone in the control room understood. The visitors were preparing to leave, their observation complete, their test administered. Whether humanity had passed or failed remained to be seen. "Colonel," Marsh said quietly, not looking away from her notes, "I need you to understand something. What we witnessed tonight, what we learned, it can't be hidden forever. The truth has a way of emerging, especially truth this profound. But how that truth emerges, the context in which it's revealed, that could make all the difference." Briggs knew she was right. He'd been thinking the same thing since the entity had vanished from the equipment room. This encounter would be reported, would be analyzed, would be classified and compartmentalized and buried under layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. But pieces would leak out, witnesses would talk, and eventually the world would know that on February 23, 1961, humanity had been visited by something from beyond the stars. The question was whether that revelation would unite humanity or tear it apart. "What do you recommend, Doctor?" he asked, respecting her judgment even if he didn't always agree with her conclusions. Marsh finally looked up from her notes, her eyes reflecting the pulsing light from outside. "Tell the truth, but tell it carefully. Don't hide what happened, but provide context. Make people understand that this wasn't an invasion or an attack. It was contact, communication between intelligences trying to understand each other. Frame it as an opportunity rather than a threat. Because that's what it is, Colonel. This is our chance to join something bigger than ourselves, to become part of a galactic community we didn't even know existed." "And if the higher-ups decide to classify everything?" Briggs asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Then we'll have failed the test," Marsh replied simply. "Not because we lied to the public, but because we lied to ourselves. We'll have chosen fear over hope, isolation over connection. And those entities out there, they'll know. They'll see that humanity isn't ready, and they'll leave us alone until we are. decades, centuries, maybe forever. The spheres pulsing reached a crescendo, their light becoming almost painful to look at directly. And then, in perfect synchronization, all 9 vessels began to rise. There was no sound this time, no dramatic display of power. They simply lifted from the frozen ground as if gravity had ceased to affect them, their ascent smooth and controlled. The distortion fields expanded as they rose, creating ripples in the air that made the stars beyond seem to dance and shimmer. Rodriguez had returned to his dead console out of habit, though there was nothing to monitor without power. But as the spheres rose, he noticed something. "The temperature's rising," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "Inside the station, it's getting warmer. Whatever field they were generating, it's breaking down as they leave." Marsh was already scribbling in her notebook, documenting every detail of the departure. The field must have been localized, centered on their positions. As they increase altitude, the effect on the station diminishes. By the time they reach their previous altitude, we should be back to normal, or at least as normal as we can be after tonight. The 9 spheres continued their ascent, and as they rose, Briggs could feel the oppressive sense of alien presence beginning to lift. It was like a weight he hadn't fully realized he was carrying, a pressure on his consciousness that had been subtle but pervasive. With their departure, he could think more clearly, could process what had happened without the distraction of their overwhelming otherness. At 5,000 feet, the spheres paused in their ascent and rearranged themselves into a new formation. Instead of a circle, they now formed a perfect triangle, with one sphere at the apex and the others spread out in precise geometric patterns. The display lasted for several seconds, long enough for everyone to see and understand. It was a final message, a goodbye rendered in mathematics and light. Then, in an instant, all 9 spheres shot upward at impossible speed, becoming points of light indistinguishable from stars before vanishing entirely into the darkness above. The moment they disappeared, power returned to Station Delta 7. Lights blazed to life throughout the facility, equipment hummed back into operation, and the welcome warmth of the heating system began to chase away the Arctic cold that had invaded during the blackout. It was jarring after the extended darkness, almost painful, but it was also deeply comforting. The familiar sounds and sensations of the station represented a return to the world they knew, even if that world had been forever changed by what they'd witnessed. Rodriguez was the first to react, jumping to his console and frantically checking systems. "Everything's coming back online, Colonel. Generators, communications, radar, all systems nominal. It's like the blackout never happened, except..." He trailed off, staring at his screen with confusion. "Except what, Sergeant?" Briggs prompted, moving to look over Rodriguez's shoulder. "The radar logs, sir. They're completely intact. Every moment of the encounter was recorded, from initial detection through landing and departure. We have data on their speed, altitude, heat signatures, everything. It's all here, as if the system never lost power." Dr. Marsh had abandoned her handwritten notes and was now at her own console, pulling up the recorded data. "They wanted us to have this," she said with certainty. "They could have wiped the records, could have left us with nothing but our memories and eyewitness testimony, but they didn't. They made sure we'd have proof, documentation that could be studied and analyzed. This is part of the test, Colonel. They're seeing what we'll do with objective evidence of their existence." Hartford was on the communication console, his fingers flying across the controls. "Sir, I'm getting through to NORAD. They're asking for an immediate report on our status. They registered unusual atmospheric readings in our area and were concerned when we went dark." Briggs felt the weight of command settle onto his shoulders once more. This was the moment of truth. How he reported this encounter, what he chose to emphasize or downplay, would shape how the military and potentially the world responded to the revelation of extraterrestrial intelligence. It was too much responsibility for any one person, but that's what command meant. Someone had to make the hard decisions. Tell NORAD we experienced a power outage due to unexpected atmospheric phenomena, Briggs said carefully. Tell them we have unusual radar data that requires immediate analysis by specialists. Request a secure line to higher command. I need to speak directly with someone who has the clearance and authority to handle what we're about to report. Understood, sir, Hartford replied, relaying the message. While Hartford worked on establishing the communication link, Briggs turned to address the crew of Station Delta 7. They were all looking at him with expressions that mixed fear, excitement, and uncertainty. These men and women had witnessed something that most of humanity still believed was impossible, and they were looking to him for guidance on how to process it. I want everyone to document what they saw tonight, Briggs said firmly. Individual reports, as detailed as possible. What you observed, what you felt, what you thought during the encounter. Don't embellish, don't minimize. Just tell the truth as you experienced it. These reports will be classified, probably buried under layers of security that'll make them inaccessible for decades. But someday, when the world is ready, your testimony will matter. It'll be proof that this happened, that we weren't crazy or mistaken, so make them count. Colonel, what about the footage? Rodriguez asked, gesturing to the backup film cameras that had been running throughout the encounter. We got the whole thing on film, the landing, the entities emerging, all of it. Briggs felt a chill run down his spine. Film footage of extraterrestrial entities at a classified military installation. If that got out before the world was ready, the panic and chaos could be catastrophic. But if it was buried too deep, hidden too well, then the truth might never emerge. It was the impossible balance, and he was expected to find it. Secure the footage, he ordered. Make copies, multiple copies, and store them separately. If something happens to one set, we'll still have the evidence. And, Rodriguez, I want you to personally ensure that at least one copy ends up somewhere that can't be easily destroyed or classified into oblivion. Use your judgment on where, but make it happen. Rodriguez nodded, understanding the implicit trust Briggs was placing in him. Yes, sir, I'll take care of it. Dr. Marsh approached Briggs, her notebook clutched to her chest like a shield. Colonel, I need to ask. When you report this up the chain of command, are you going to tell them everything? About the communication attempt, about what the entity conveyed to us, about the ship in orbit? It was the question Briggs had been dreading. The complete truth would sound insane, would be dismissed or suppressed by people who couldn't accept the reality of what had occurred. But a sanitized version, stripped of the most incredible details, would be a lie that diminished the significance of the encounter. Where was the line between responsible disclosure and self-defeating honesty? I'm going to tell them that we had contact with entities demonstrating technology far beyond our current capabilities, Briggs said slowly, thinking through each word. I'm going to tell them that these entities showed no hostile intent and appeared to be conducting scientific observation. I'm going to recommend that we prepare for the possibility of future contact and that we develop protocols for communication and interaction. As for the rest, the more subjective interpretations and implications, I'll include them in my detailed report but acknowledge that they're based on limited understanding of alien communication methods. Marsh considered this, then nodded. It's a good balance, Colonel. Enough truth to be taken seriously, enough caution to avoid immediate dismissal. Though I suspect that once they review the radar data and film footage, even the most skeptical officials will have to acknowledge that something extraordinary occurred. Hartford called out from the communication console. Colonel, I've got General Stratton on the secure line. He's requesting immediate verbal report before you submit written documentation. Briggs took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and picked up the secure phone. General Marcus Stratton was a hard man, a veteran of 2 wars who had little patience for nonsense or exaggeration. He was also, Briggs hoped, wise enough to recognize truth when he heard it, no matter how impossible that truth might seem. General Stratton, this is Colonel Briggs at Station Delta 7, he began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to report. Sir, I need to inform you that at 1400 hours local time, we detected and tracked 9 unidentified aerial contacts, demonstrating flight characteristics inconsistent with any known aircraft, terrestrial or otherwise. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Stratton finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. Colonel, are you telling me you had visual confirmation of unidentified craft? Yes, sir. Visual, radar, and direct observation at close range. The craft landed in formation around this station and remained on the ground for approximately 23 minutes before departing at high speed. We have documentation, sir. Film footage, radar logs, multiple eyewitness testimonies from trained military personnel. Another pause, longer this time. Briggs could almost hear the gears turning in Stratton's mind, the general weighing possibilities and implications. And the craft, Colonel, did you observe any occupants? This was it, the moment where the report went from unusual to potentially career-ending. Yes, sir. We observed entities emerging from the craft. Humanoid in general form, but clearly not human. One entity entered the station and was observed at close range by myself, Lieutenant Hartford, Sergeant Rodriguez, and Dr. Marsh. We attempted communication with limited success. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Briggs wondered if the connection had been lost. Then Stratton spoke, his voice heavy with implications that Briggs couldn't fully read. Colonel, I'm going to send a team to Delta 7 immediately. Nobody leaves that station. Nobody speaks to anyone outside the facility until that team arrives. You understand me? This is now a matter of national security at the highest level. Understood, sir. My crew is already preparing detailed reports. We'll have everything ready for your team's arrival. Good. And, Colonel, one more thing. What you saw tonight, what you're reporting, it's not the first time. It's not even the 10th time. But it might be the most well-documented. That data you collected, that footage, it could change everything. Or it could be buried forever. That's not your decision to make, but I want you to know that your honesty in this report will not go unnoticed. Stratton out. The line went dead, and Briggs slowly lowered the phone. Not the first time. The implication was staggering. How many other encounters had there been? How many other military personnel had witnessed these visitors and reported them up the chain of command, only to have their reports classified and forgotten? And what did it mean that Stratton had acknowledged the reality of what Briggs had reported without hesitation or disbelief? What did he say? Marsh asked, reading the expression on Briggs's face. He's sending a team, and he said this wasn't the first encounter. Briggs shook his head, still processing. Doctor, I think we've just stumbled into something much bigger than a single night of strange visitors. I think we found evidence of a reality that's been hidden from the public for who knows how long. Marsh's eyes widened with understanding. The government knows. They've known about extraterrestrial visitation, and they've been keeping it secret. Colonel, if that's true, if there have been other encounters, then tonight wasn't about first contact. It was about something else entirely. It was about control, Briggs said, the pieces falling into place. The entities told us they've been observing Earth for a long time. They've made contact before, probably multiple times with multiple governments, and each time, those governments have made the same decision to keep it secret, to control the narrative, to prevent panic. Tonight was different because they wanted it documented, wanted it captured on film and radar in ways that can't be easily dismissed or explained away. They're forcing the issue, pushing us toward public disclosure whether we're ready or not. But why? Hartford asked, having overheard the conversation. Why now? What's changed? Dr. Marsh flipped through her notes, finding the passage where she documented her fragmentary understanding of the entity's communication. They said we were approaching a critical point, that our technology was advancing to where we'd detect them more easily. Maybe that's the trigger. Maybe they've decided that humanity can't be kept in the dark much longer, so they're taking steps to prepare us for the revelation. Rodriguez looked up from his console, where he was securing copies of the radar data. So, we're part of a plan? This whole encounter was orchestrated to force disclosure? Maybe, Briggs admitted. Or maybe they're just being pragmatic. If contact is inevitable, better to control how it happens than to risk a panicked discovery. Either way, we're now part of something much larger than ourselves. Our actions tonight, our reports, our testimony, they'll be studied and analyzed by people far above our pay grade. And eventually, one way or another, the truth will come out. How long do you think it'll take? One of the radar operators asked. Before the world knows the truth? Briggs considered the question, thinking about bureaucracy and secrecy and the slow grinding wheels of government decision-making. Years, he said finally. Maybe decades. The people who control these secrets won't give them up easily. But the entities, they're patient. They can wait. And if we don't disclose voluntarily, they'll find other ways to make their existence known. Tonight was a message not just to us, but to everyone watching from above. The time for complete secrecy is ending. The crew of Station Delta 7 fell into thoughtful silence, each person processing the magnitude of what had occurred and what it might mean for the future. Outside, the Arctic night had returned to its normal state, dark and cold and empty of impossible lights. The only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was the perfect circles of bare ground where the spheres had landed, circles that would puzzle scientists for years to come. As the hours passed and they waited for General Stratton's team to arrive, Briggs found himself repeatedly returning to the window, staring up at the stars with new understanding. Somewhere up there, beyond the reach of Earth's atmosphere, a ship full of alien entities was observing, recording, judging. Humanity was being tested, evaluated, prepared for a future that most people couldn't yet imagine. And down here, in a frozen military outpost at the top of the world, 12 people carried the burden of that knowledge. They had seen the future, touched the impossible, and survived to tell the tale. Whether anyone would believe them, whether their testimony would matter in the grand scheme of things, remained to be seen. But Briggs knew one thing with absolute certainty. The universe was far stranger, far more wonderful, and far more terrifying than anyone had imagined. And humanity's isolation, its childhood as a species unaware of the galactic community around it, was coming to an end. What came next would depend on choices made in the coming years, on whether fear or hope would guide humanity's response to the greatest revelation in its history. The Arctic Echo, they would call this incident in the classified reports. A brief moment when the silence between worlds was broken, when two intelligences reached across the vast gulf of space and evolution to touch, however briefly. It was just one encounter among many, but it might be the one that mattered, the one that changed everything. As dawn approached, painting the Arctic sky in shades of gray and purple, Briggs allowed himself a moment of hope. Maybe humanity would pass the test. Maybe they'd prove worthy of joining the cosmic community. Maybe the fear and suspicion that had defined human nature for so long could be overcome by curiosity and wonder. Or maybe not. Maybe the secrets would remain buried, the evidence suppressed, the truth denied for another generation or more. But even if that happened, even if the official story became weather balloons and mass hallucination, Briggs would know. They would all know. And that knowledge, once gained, could never be truly forgotten. The future was coming, ready or not. And on February 23, 1961, in a frozen outpost called Station Delta 7, 12 people had witnessed its first light breaking over the horizon of human understanding. You think you know what happened during the Cold War? The spy games, the nuclear standoffs, the political chess matches that could have ended civilization. You don't know half of it. Because buried beneath layers of classification and denial, there are stories that never made it into the history books. Stories about things that shouldn't exist, witnessed by people who were told to forget what they saw. This is one of those stories. Berlin, in November 1966, was a city divided not just by concrete and barbed wire, but by ideology and fear. The wall had been up for 5 years, splitting families and turning a once great metropolis into a Cold War chessboard, where every move mattered. Tempelhof Air Base sat in the American sector, a strategic installation that served as both military outpost and symbol of Western presence deep in hostile territory. The base housed some of the most sophisticated radar equipment in Europe, constantly scanning the skies for Soviet aircraft that might signal the beginning of World War III. Agent Walter Kane had been stationed in Berlin for 3 years, long enough to know that the city held secrets that went beyond the obvious political tensions. A veteran of the CIA's Technical Services Division, Kane specialized in analyzing anomalous radar signatures and unexplained aerial phenomena. It wasn't a job that existed on any official organizational chart, but in the shadowy world of Cold War intelligence, official positions meant very little. What mattered was that Kane knew how to recognize when something didn't fit the pattern, and more importantly, he knew when to keep his mouth shut. Lieutenant Helena Carter was different. Young, brilliant, and dangerously curious, she'd been assigned to Tempelhof 6 months earlier as part of a joint RF-USF technical analysis program. Her official job was evaluating radar system efficiency and identifying potential weaknesses in the Allied detection network. Her unofficial job, the one Kane suspected she didn't even know she'd been recruited for, was to serve as a second pair of eyes on anything unusual that crossed the screens. The British had their own interest in unexplained phenomena, though they were even more secretive about it than the Americans. November 17th started cold and overcast, typical Berlin weather that matched the city's perpetual state of tension. Kane arrived at Tempelhof at 0600 hours for what should have been a routine briefing on Soviet air activity patterns. The conference room was half empty, most personnel still fighting off sleep as they nursed bitter coffee and tried to focus on reconnaissance photos that all looked identical after a while. Kane found himself sitting across from Lieutenant Carter, who was studying a technical manual with the kind of intensity that suggested she actually found radar calibration procedures fascinating. "Morning, Lieutenant," Kane said, more out of professional courtesy than genuine interest in conversation. "Find anything interesting in there?" Carter looked up, her gray eyes sharp despite the early hour. "Agent Kane, and yes, actually. There's a pattern in the phase array calibration data from the past 3 weeks that doesn't match the predicted degradation curve. Small deviations, but consistent. Almost like someone's been testing our detection capabilities." Kane felt something cold settle in his stomach. In Berlin, paranoia wasn't a mental illness, It was survival instinct. The Soviets were constantly probing Western defenses, looking for weaknesses, testing response times, but Carter's observation suggested something more systematic, more deliberate than the usual cat-and-mouse games. "Have you reported this up the chain?" he asked carefully. "Not yet. I wanted to verify my calculations first. Data anomalies can mean equipment malfunction just as easily as hostile action. But Agent Kane, if I'm right about this pattern, someone has been systematically mapping our radar coverage for weeks without triggering any of our alarm protocols." Before Kane could respond, the briefing room door burst open and a junior radar operator practically fell through it, his face pale and his breath coming in short gasps. "Sir, we have a situation in the control room. You need to come now." Kane and Carter were on their feet immediately, following the operator through the labyrinthine corridors of Tempelhof's underground facility. The control room was the heart of the base's air defense system, a climate-controlled bunker filled with radar screens, communication equipment, and the constant low hum of electronic surveillance. When they arrived, they found the room in controlled chaos, operators shouting readings back and forth, while supervisors barked orders and tried to make sense of conflicting data. The primary radar display, a large circular screen that normally showed a clear picture of airspace for 200 miles in every direction, was dark. Not flickering, not showing static, just completely black as if someone had switched it off. But the power indicators showed the system was active, the cooling fans were running, and every other component of the radar array was functioning normally. It was just the display that had failed, and in the most critical system on the base. "When did this happen?" Kane demanded, his command voice cutting through the noise. Master Sergeant Douglas, the shift supervisor, looked up with barely concealed panic in his eyes. 0647 hours, sir. One moment we had full coverage, the next the screen just went dark. We've tried rebooting, switching to backup systems, everything. Nothing brings it back. It's like the radar is working but refusing to show us what it sees." Lieutenant Carter was already at one of the diagnostic consoles, her fingers flying across switches and dials with practiced efficiency. "The signal processing is operational," she reported, her voice tight with concentration. "Data is coming in from the antenna array, but it's not being rendered to the display. It's as if there's a filter blocking the visual output while leaving the raw data intact." "Can you access the raw data directly?" Kane asked, his mind already working through implications and possibilities. A radar blackout in Berlin, even for a few minutes, created a vulnerability that Soviet forces could exploit. But if the data was still being collected, just not displayed, that suggested something else entirely. Something that made Kane's instincts scream warnings. Carter nodded, switching the diagnostic console to a different mode. Numbers began scrolling across a smaller screen, coordinates and signal strengths and bearing indicators that meant nothing to most people but told a complete story to trained analysts. As Kane watched over her shoulder, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There was a contact. A solid, persistent radar return at 30,000 feet, holding position directly over the center of Berlin. It had been there for at least 15 minutes based on the data logs, just hanging motionless in the sky while the primary display conveniently went dark. The return was massive, easily the size of a strategic bomber, but it showed none of the characteristic signatures of known Soviet aircraft. The radar cross-section was all wrong, the reflection pattern inconsistent with any conventional airframe. "Lieutenant, are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Kane asked quietly, not wanting to cause panic among the other operators. Carter's face had gone pale. "Yes, sir." "Unidentified contact, stationary position, bearing 270 degrees, altitude 30,000 feet, distance 12 kilometers. Agent Kane, nothing holds station like that." Aircraft don't hover at 30,000 feet. They can't. Master Sergeant Douglas had noticed their conversation and moved closer. "What have you got, Lieutenant?" Before Carter could answer, every light in the control room flickered. It was just for a second, barely noticeable, but in a facility with backup power systems and redundant electrical grids, it was impossible. At the same instant, the primary radar display blazed back to life. The screen lit up showing the standard air traffic picture, commercial flights, military patrols, everything exactly where it should be. Everything except the mysterious contact that had been hovering over Berlin. It was simply gone. The raw data logs that Carter had been monitoring now showed nothing unusual. The timeline was intact, the records were complete, but the massive radar return that had been clearly visible just moments ago had vanished as if it had never existed. Kane felt the weight of certainty settle over him. This wasn't equipment failure. This wasn't Soviet trickery. This was something else, something that had the capability to manipulate sophisticated radar systems and apparently edit its own presence out of the records. "False alarm," Sergeant Douglas announced to the room, relief evident in his voice. "Looks like we had a software glitch in the display rendering system. Everything's back to normal now. Continue standard operations." The tension in the control room eased as operators returned to their stations, chalking up the incident to one more malfunction in the long list of technical problems that plagued Cold War electronics. But Kane noticed that Lieutenant Carter hadn't moved from the diagnostic console. She was staring at the screen with an expression that mixed confusion and growing realization. "Agent Kane," she said softly, "the logs have been altered. I'm looking at the same data stream I accessed 2 minutes ago, but the contact is gone from the records. Not deleted, but changed, as if it was never there in the first place. Sir, that's not possible with our security protocols. These systems are hardened against tampering with multiple redundancy checks. No one could edit the logs this quickly, this completely, without leaving any trace." Kane felt the familiar chill of working in the shadows of intelligence operations. He'd seen classified technology before, exotic systems that officially didn't exist, weapons and surveillance equipment that operated on principles the public wouldn't learn about for decades. But this felt different. This felt like they'd stumbled onto something that existed in an entirely different category of secrets. "Sergeant Douglas," Kane said carefully, "I need you to pull the backup tapes for the last 30 minutes, all of them, including the ones that feed to off-site storage. And I need them now before anything else has a chance to malfunction." Douglas frowned. "Sir, with respect, we just had a display glitch. Standard procedure is to run diagnostics and file a maintenance report. Pulling backup tapes is going to trigger all kinds of paperwork and questions from headquarters. Then we'll answer the questions," Kane replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Those tapes are evidence, Sergeant, and I want them secured before anyone decides they're not important. Lieutenant Carter, I want you to personally witness the tape retrieval and maintain chain of custody. Nobody touches those records without both of us present." As Carter and Douglas moved to secure the tapes, Kane stepped away from the consoles and keyed his radio to a secure frequency. "Control, this is Kane. I need to speak with Colonel Reeves immediately. Priority 1. The response came back within seconds. "Kane, this is Reeves. Go ahead." "Sir, we have a situation at Tempelhof. I need you to come to the radar control room, and I need you to come alone. This is a compartmented matter." There was a long pause. Colonel Reeves had been military intelligence long enough to recognize code words when he heard them. Compartmented meant something that existed outside normal channels, something that only certain people with certain clearances were allowed to know about. "Understood. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Reeves out." While they waited for the colonel, Kane pulled Carter aside to a quiet corner of the control room. "Lieutenant, I need to ask you something." and I need you to answer honestly. Have you ever been briefed on Project Blue Book? Carter's expression showed recognition. The Air Force program investigating UFO reports? I've heard of it, obviously, but I've never been officially briefed. That's an American program, and I'm RAF. Why? Because what we just witnessed fits a pattern, Kane said carefully. Radar blackouts, objects that appear and disappear, records that mysteriously become corrupted or altered. The official explanation is always equipment failure or operator error, but, Lieutenant, I've been doing this job long enough to recognize when the official explanation is a cover story. You're saying we just saw a UFO, Carter said, her voice flat with skepticism. A flying saucer over Berlin. I'm saying we saw something that shouldn't exist according to known technology, Kane corrected. Whether it's extraterrestrial, experimental Soviet technology, or something else entirely, I don't know, but I do know that someone went to considerable effort to make sure we didn't get a good look at it, and that whoever that someone is has access to capabilities that frighten me. Carter was silent for a long moment, processing the implications. If this was Soviet technology, they wouldn't hide it. They'd want us to know they could penetrate our airspace at will. The psychological warfare value alone would be enormous. But if it's something else, something that both sides might be keeping secret. She trailed off, the implications too vast to fully articulate. Then we're all playing a different game than we thought, Kane finished for her. And the question becomes whether the people at the top of our respective intelligence services know about it, or whether there's another level above them that's been keeping these secrets. Colonel Reeves arrived exactly 10 minutes later, his expression neutral, but his eyes sharp with intelligence officers' wariness. Kane gave him a brief summary of the incident, leaving out his own theories but sticking to the observable facts. The radar had gone dark. A massive, unidentified contact had been visible in the raw data during the blackout. When the display came back online, the contact was gone, and the records had been altered. Reeves listened without interrupting, his face betraying nothing. When Kane finished, the colonel was silent for several long seconds before speaking. Agent Kane, Lieutenant Carter, what I'm about to tell you is classified at a level that requires immediate need-to-know justification. If you repeat anything you hear in this conversation to anyone without proper clearance, you'll spend the rest of your careers in military prison. Do you understand? They both nodded, though Kane felt his pulse quickening. He'd expected Reeves to dismiss the incident, to chalk it up to equipment malfunction and tell them to get back to work. The fact that the colonel was instead raising the classification level suggested that Kane's instincts had been correct. This was something bigger than a simple anomaly. This isn't the first incident of this type at Tempelhof, Reeves said quietly. We've had 7 similar events in the past 18 months. Radar blackouts lasting between 3 and 20 minutes, always accompanied by reports of unidentified contacts that vanish from the records. The pattern is consistent enough that it can't be coincidence, but subtle enough that most personnel dismiss it as equipment aging or environmental interference. 7 incidents and nobody's investigated? Carter asked, disbelief evident in her voice. Oh, they've been investigated, Reeves replied, by people with clearances higher than mine and agendas I'm not privy to. The official conclusion each time is equipment malfunction. The unofficial conclusion, the one that only exists in conversations like this, is that someone or something has been conducting surveillance of Berlin with technology that makes our best systems look like children's toys. Kane felt pieces clicking into place. The pattern Lieutenant Carter found in the calibration data. Someone's been mapping our coverage. Exactly, Reeves confirmed. They're not trying to avoid our radar. They're studying it, learning its capabilities and limitations, which suggests a level of sophistication and patience that doesn't match any known Soviet operation. The KGB is good, but they're not this good. So what do we do? Kane asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. You secure those backup tapes and turn them over to me personally, Reeves said. I'll see that they reach the appropriate channels. Then you write up a report classifying this as equipment malfunction and return to regular duties. The incident will be noted in the maintenance logs, repairs will be scheduled, and life will go on. While something unknown continues to surveil one of the most sensitive locations in Europe, Carter said, anger creeping into her voice. Sir, with respect, that's not acceptable. If there's a security threat, we have an obligation to— Lieutenant, Reeves interrupted, his voice hard. You have an obligation to follow orders and maintain operational security. What's happening here is above your pay grade and mine. There are people who specialize in this kind of problem, and they're aware of the situation. Our job is to maintain the illusion of normalcy while they do whatever it is they do. That's how this works in the real world. Kane recognized the tone. Reeves was delivering orders he didn't necessarily agree with, following a protocol that had been established by people far up the chain of command. The colonel was a good officer, but he was also a pragmatist who knew when pushing back would accomplish nothing except ending his career. Understood, sir, Kane said, shooting Carter a warning glance before she could protest further. We'll have the tapes ready for transfer within the hour. After Reeves departed, Carter turned to Kane with barely controlled frustration. We're just going to let this go? Something is violating our airspace, manipulating our surveillance systems, and we're going to pretend it's a maintenance issue. We're going to follow orders, Kane said firmly. But that doesn't mean we stop paying attention. Lieutenant, you found a pattern in the calibration data. That pattern is still there, regardless of what our official report says. Keep tracking it. Document everything. If this is part of a larger intelligence operation, our observations might prove valuable down the line. And if it's not, if this really is something unexplained, something that both sides are choosing to ignore because acknowledging it would require admitting there are forces beyond our control. Kane didn't have a good answer for that. The Cold War was built on certainties, on clear delineations between East and West, us and them. The possibility that there was a third party in play, something that operated by rules neither superpower understood, undermined the entire strategic framework that kept the world from sliding into nuclear war. Better to deny, to classify, to bury the truth under layers of bureaucracy than face the implications. But denial didn't change reality, and as Kane and Carter secured the backup tapes and prepared their sanitized report, both of them knew they'd witnessed something that wouldn't stay buried forever. The question was what would happen when the truth finally emerged, and whether humanity would be ready for the answer. The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze of normalcy. Radar operations continued without incident. The maintenance crew examined the display systems and found nothing wrong, exactly as Kane had expected. The backup tapes were sealed and handed over to Colonel Reeves, who accepted them without comment and disappeared into the classified corridors where the real decisions got made. By the time the evening shift took over, the incident had already faded into just another footnote in the daily operations log. But that night, as Kane sat in his apartment in the American sector, staring at the lights of East Berlin across the wall, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The world he thought he understood, the clear-cut battle between capitalism and communism, suddenly felt like a stage show obscuring a deeper reality. And somewhere in the classified archives, in reports that would remain hidden for decades, was evidence that humanity wasn't calling all the shots in its own affairs. The Cold War would continue for another 25 years. The wall would eventually fall. Empires would collapse and new orders would emerge. But the incident at Tempelhof Air Base on November 17, 1966, would remain classified, buried under layers of denial and bureaucratic inertia. The 12 men and women who witnessed it would be sworn to secrecy, their observations dismissed as equipment malfunction, their questions answered with classifications and compartmented programs they weren't cleared to know about. And in the sky over Berlin, unseen by radar and unacknowledged by those who knew, something continued its patient observation of a divided city and a species playing with forces it didn't fully understand. The game was bigger than Cold War politics, older than human civilization, and far from over. But Agent Walter Kane and Lieutenant Helena Carter would spend the rest of their careers trying to understand what they'd seen that day, collecting pieces of a puzzle that powerful forces didn't want solved. This was just the beginning of their journey into the shadows, where official history and hidden truth diverged. And what they would discover in the weeks and months ahead would force them to question everything they thought they knew about the world and humanity's place in it. The metallic object that had hovered over Berlin for those critical minutes was gone, but its presence had been recorded, if only briefly. And once truth is recorded, even classified truth, it becomes impossible to completely erase. Somewhere in the archives, evidence survived. Somewhere in the memories of witnesses, the reality persisted. And someday, somehow, the full story would emerge. But not yet. Not while the Cold War raged and the world teetered on the edge of nuclear annihilation. Not while admitting the truth meant undermining the illusion of human control that kept civilization functioning. So, the silence was maintained. The reports were classified, and life in divided Berlin continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Tomorrow would bring new crises, new confrontations between East and West. The shadow game of espionage and counter-espionage would continue. And Agent Walter Kane would return to Tempelhof Air Base, watching the radar screens and wondering what they weren't being allowed to see. The Berlin radar blackout was over, but the questions it raised had only just begun. 3 days after the incident, Lieutenant Carter requested a meeting with Kane at a cafe in the French sector. She'd chosen the location carefully, neutral ground, far enough from Tempelhof that casual surveillance was unlikely, public enough that their meeting would seem routine. Kane arrived 10 minutes early out of habit, scanning the room for familiar faces or anyone paying too much attention. The cafe was half empty, populated by students and locals trying to pretend their city wasn't a powder keg waiting for a spark. Carter arrived precisely on time, sliding into the booth across from him with a folder tucked under her arm. She ordered coffee in passable French, waited until the waitress was out of earshot, then leaned forward with an intensity that told Kane she'd found something significant. "I pulled historical data from the past 2 years," she said quietly. "Cross-referenced maintenance logs, power fluctuations, atmospheric conditions, anything that might correlate with the radar anomalies. Agent Kane, there's a pattern. Every incident occurs during periods of heightened east-west tension. The week before the incident, there were 3 attempted border crossings that ended in shootings. 2 weeks before that, a Soviet MiG violated West Berlin airspace. Each event preceded by small-scale crises that never made international news but increased military readiness." Kane processed this information, his analytical mind already exploring implications. So, either someone is taking advantage of our heightened alert status to conduct surveillance, or the incidents themselves are causing the tensions. Which do you think it is? "I think it's neither," Carter replied, opening her folder to reveal pages of handwritten notes covered in calculations and timelines. "I think something is monitoring us specifically during crisis points, like they're studying how we react under stress, documenting our responses to potential conflict triggers. Agent Kane, if I'm right, we're not dealing with Soviet intelligence. We're dealing with something conducting a long-term behavioral study of military forces in a divided city." The implications made Kane's coffee taste bitter. Scientific observation suggested detachment, patience, resources that extended beyond quarterly intelligence budgets and 5-year strategic plans. It suggested whoever was behind this operated on timescales that made Cold War tensions look like brief squabbles between children. "Have you shared this analysis with anyone else?" Kane asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. "Of course not. After Colonel Reeves' little speech about classification levels and military prison, I'm not eager to brief anyone who might decide my career is expendable for asking the wrong questions." Carter paused, her gray eyes searching Kane's face. "But you already knew about this, didn't you? Before the incident on the 17th, you knew something was happening at Tempelhof." Kane considered how much to reveal. Trust was a luxury in intelligence work, easily exploited and rarely rewarded. But Carter had proven herself capable, and more importantly, willing to look past official explanations when the evidence demanded it. Those qualities were rare and valuable. "I've been tracking similar incidents across NATO installations for 2 years," Kane admitted. "Tempelhof is the most active location, but there have been events at bases in Turkey, Norway, and England, always during periods of heightened readiness, always with radar systems that mysteriously malfunction and recover. The pattern is consistent enough to rule out coincidence, but subtle enough that most people dismiss it as equipment aging or operator error." "And you never reported this pattern?" Carter asked, though her tone suggested she already understood why. "I reported it to my superiors at Langley. They thanked me for my diligence, classified my findings, and told me to continue monitoring. 3 months later, I was reassigned to Berlin with instructions to maintain awareness but avoid drawing attention to the phenomena. The message was clear. Someone knows what's happening and has decided that public knowledge would be more dangerous than continued observation." Carter leaned back, frustration evident in the set of her shoulders. "So, we're supposed to just watch while something studies us like laboratory rats? Document the experiments while pretending we don't notice the cage? Unless you want to end your career and possibly your freedom by going public with information that will be immediately discredited and denied," Kane said bluntly. "Lieutenant, I've been in this business long enough to recognize when the game is rigged. Whoever is behind the compartmentation of these incidents has resources and influence that extend beyond normal intelligence channels. Fighting them directly would be suicide." "Then what do we do?" Carter demanded. "Accept it? Pretend we didn't see what we saw?" Kane glanced around the cafe, confirming that nobody was paying attention to their conversation, then lowered his voice even further. "We do what intelligence officers have done throughout history when facing forces beyond their control. We document everything, preserve evidence, and wait for the right moment to act. The truth has a way of emerging, Lieutenant, but it needs to survive long enough to be discovered." He slid a small key across the table. "There's a storage locker in the British sector, address written on the tag. I've been maintaining a private archive of incidents, reports that never made it into official files, witness statements that were conveniently lost. Your pattern analysis would fit nicely with what I've already collected. If something happens to me, if I suddenly transfer or have an unfortunate accident, that archive needs to survive." Carter took the key, understanding the weight of what Kane was offering. "You're creating an insurance policy, evidence that can't be classified because it exists outside official channels." "I'm creating a record of truth," Kane corrected. "Whether that truth ever sees daylight is beyond my control, but at least it will exist, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to bring it into the open." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the cafe window, they could see East German border guards confronting someone at a nearby checkpoint. The scene was routine enough, Berlin witnessed dozens of such confrontations daily, but Kane noticed Carter's attention focusing on something else. She was staring up at the overcast sky, her expression shifting from curiosity to alarm. "Agent Kane," she said slowly, "do you see that?" Kane followed her gaze. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the low gray clouds that perpetually hung over Berlin in November. Then he noticed a distortion in the cloud layer, a circular area where the clouds seemed to be moving differently, swirling in patterns that defied the prevailing wind. And at the center of that distortion, barely visible against the gray backdrop, was a dark shape that remained perfectly still despite being at an altitude where wind speed should have made hovering impossible. "Everyone else is watching the checkpoint," Carter observed quietly. "They're not looking up, they don't see it." Kane felt the familiar chill of recognizing a significant event in progress. The object, whatever it was, wasn't trying to hide. It was simply positioned in such a way that natural human attention patterns would cause people to miss it. The confrontation at the checkpoint was theater, a distraction that kept eyes at ground level while something infinitely more important happened overhead. "We need to get back to Tempelhof," Kane said, standing and throwing money on the table. "If that thing is what I think it is, the radar will be going crazy right about now." They took Carter's car, driving through Berlin's crowded streets with the kind of controlled urgency that avoided attention while covering ground quickly. Kane used a secure radio to call ahead to Tempelhof, requesting an immediate status check on radar operations. The response came back within seconds, and it was exactly what he'd feared. "All radar systems experiencing intermittent malfunctions," the voice reported. "Display flickering, ghost returns, signal processing anomalies. Duration approximately 15 minutes and ongoing. Maintenance crews are investigating but haven't identified a source." "Tell them not to bother," Kane replied. "This is a known issue. We're en route to assess the situation." By the time they reached Tempelhof, the radar systems had recovered, just as Kane knew they would. The control room was in a state of organized confusion, operators running diagnostics and filing reports while supervisors tried to determine whether the malfunction was serious enough to report up the chain. Master Sergeant Douglas looked relieved when Kane and Carter entered, clearly hoping that someone else would take responsibility for explaining why the base's most critical systems had just suffered simultaneous failures. "Agent Kane, Lieutenant Carter, thank God. We've had multiple cascading failures across all radar bands. No single point of origin, no pattern to the malfunctions. It's like the entire electromagnetic spectrum just decided to stop cooperating for a quarter hour." Kane moved to the primary display console, noting that it now showed a normal air traffic picture. "Any unidentified contacts during the malfunction period?" Douglas hesitated, and in that moment of silence, Kane knew the answer. "There were some ambiguous returns, sir. Could have been atmospheric phenomena, could have been equipment artifacts. With the systems malfunctioning, it's impossible to say with certainty." "But the data logs would show those returns," Carter interjected. "Ambiguous or not, they'd be recorded." "Funny thing about that, Lieutenant," Douglas said, his expression uncomfortable. "The logs for the malfunction period are corrupted. Not erased, just scrambled. The timestamps are intact, but the actual radar return data is nonsense. Random numbers that don't correspond to any valid signal processing output. Our technicians say it's like someone ran the data through a randomization algorithm before storing it." Kane and Carter exchanged a look. The pattern was repeating, this time in broad daylight with dozens of witnesses. Radar malfunctions followed by corrupted records, leaving no evidence beyond eyewitness testimony that would be dismissed as misidentification or equipment artifacts. It was elegant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. Someone had refined the art of remaining undetected to the point where they could operate openly while ensuring no credible evidence survived. "Has this been reported to Colonel Reeves?" Kane asked. "Report is being prepared now, sir. Standard malfunction notification with preliminary assessment of possible solar activity interference. Should be on his desk within the hour." "Good. Let me know when he responds. In the meantime, Lieutenant Carter and I need to review the preliminary data before it gets sent up the chain, just to make sure we're not missing anything obvious." Douglas was happy to delegate responsibility, pointing them toward a quiet corner of the control room where archived data could be accessed without interfering with ongoing operations. Once they were relatively alone, Carter pulled up the corrupted logs and began analyzing the randomized data with the intensity of someone who refused to accept defeat. "This isn't random," she said after several minutes of study. "Look at the distribution pattern. True random data would show even distribution across all possible values. This has clustering, patterns that suggest the randomization algorithm was seeded with specific parameters. Agent Kane, whoever corrupted these logs, wasn't trying to delete the evidence. They were trying to obscure it while maintaining the appearance of technical malfunction." "Can you reverse the process?" Kane asked, though he suspected the answer would be no. If the technology existed to manipulate radar data in real time and corrupt it beyond recovery, then the people behind it were operating at a level of sophistication that made even CIA technical services look primitive. Carter worked in silence for several more minutes, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she tried various decryption algorithms and statistical analyses. Finally, she sat back with a frustrated sigh. No. Whatever process they used, it's one way. The original data is gone, replaced by something that looks like corruption, but is actually deliberate obfuscation. It's brilliant, really. Any investigation will conclude equipment failure, file a maintenance report, and move on. Unless the investigator knows what to look for, Kane said quietly. "Lieutenant, how many people do you think have the technical knowledge to recognize what you just found?" "In Berlin, maybe a dozen. In all of NATO, perhaps 100, and most of them would be too focused on their specific areas of expertise to see the larger pattern. Agent Kane, this isn't just about hiding from radar. This is about hiding from the people who operate the radar, who analyze the data, who might recognize that something impossible is happening right under their noses." The implications crystallized in Kane's mind with uncomfortable clarity. The incidents weren't just about surveillance. They were about maintaining control of information, ensuring that even when evidence was collected, it would be misinterpreted, dismissed, or buried. Someone had studied human intelligence organizations so thoroughly that they could predict how reports would be processed, where investigations would dead end, and which witnesses would be ignored. "We need to assume they're listening," Kane said, keeping his voice barely above a whisper. "If they can manipulate our radar systems remotely, they can probably access our communication networks. Anything we say or write on base could be monitored." Carter nodded, understanding the paranoia that came with operating in an environment where the rules kept changing. "Then, how do we coordinate? How do we continue investigating without tipping our hand?" Kane thought for a moment, then made a decision that would commit him to a course of action he couldn't easily reverse. "We don't investigate officially. We maintain our regular duties, file our required reports, and act like obedient intelligence officers who know when to stop asking questions. But privately, on our own time, we continue collecting evidence. We document everything, preserve testimony, and wait for a moment when going public won't result in immediate discreditation. That could take years," Carter pointed out. "Or it could take decades," Kane agreed. "But Lieutenant, what's the alternative? We could go public now, present our findings to journalists or congressional oversight committees, and within 24 hours we'd be dismissed as crackpots, our careers would be destroyed, and the incidents would continue. The only thing that would change is we'd lose our access to the very systems we need to document what's happening. Carter was silent for a long moment, weighing options that were all various shades of terrible. Finally, she nodded with visible reluctance. I hate this. I hate that we're letting something violate our airspace and manipulate our systems while we stand by and document it like we're writing a research paper. But you're right. Without credibility and institutional support, any revelation would be worse than useless. Welcome to the intelligence business, Kane said with bitter humor, where knowing the truth is easy, but getting anyone to believe it is impossible. The next weeks fell into an uneasy routine. Kane and Carter maintained their official duties while secretly documenting every anomaly, every unexplained fluctuation, every incident that didn't quite fit the official explanation. They developed a private shorthand for discussing sensitive topics in public, learned to recognize when their conversations were being monitored, and became experts at hiding evidence in plain sight. The incidents continued with irregular frequency, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes multiple events in a single day. Each followed the same pattern: radar malfunctions, corrupted data, brief glimpses of something that shouldn't exist, followed by official reports attributing everything to equipment aging or atmospheric interference. And each time, Kane added another entry to his private archive, another piece of a puzzle that might never be solved, but at least would be preserved. Carter's analysis revealed deeper patterns. The incidents clustered around specific dates, anniversaries of significant Cold War events: the Berlin airlift, the construction of the wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was as if someone was commemorating humanity's near-apocalyptic moments, studying how the world had balanced on the edge of nuclear war and somehow pulled back. The behavioral study theory seemed increasingly plausible, though it raised questions that neither Kane nor Carter wanted to fully articulate. If something was studying human conflict behavior, what were they learning? What conclusions were they drawing about a species that had developed the capability to destroy itself and came within minutes of doing so on multiple occasions? And, perhaps most troubling, what would they do with that information? December brought snow to Berlin and a new escalation in Cold War tensions. Soviet forces conducted large-scale military exercises near the East German border. NATO responded with increased readiness levels, and for a few tense days the world held its breath while politicians and generals engaged in their regular dance of brinksmanship. Kane watched the crisis unfold with a new perspective, wondering if somewhere beyond the clouds, observers were documenting humanity's latest brush with self-destruction. On December 23rd, as Berlin prepared for a Christmas shadowed by political tension, Kane received an encrypted message from Langley. The wording was deliberately vague, but the meaning was clear. His investigation into unexplained phenomena had been noted, and he was being reassigned. Effective immediately, he would return to CIA headquarters for strategic consultation on matters that couldn't be discussed over secure channels. Kane knew what this meant. Someone had decided he was asking too many questions, getting too close to truths that needed to remain hidden. The reassignment wasn't a promotion, it was a soft termination, a way to remove him from the field without the complications of a formal disciplinary action. They'd bury him in a basement office somewhere, give him meaningless reports to write, and wait for him to either accept defeat or resign in frustration. He met Carter one last time at the same cafe in the French sector, returning her key to the storage locker along with his complete archive. She listened to his explanation in grim silence, understanding that their informal investigation had just lost its most experienced member. "What do I do now?" she asked, and Kane heard the fear beneath the question. Without his institutional protection, Carter was exposed, vulnerable to the same forces that had just neutralized him. You do your job, Lieutenant. You analyze radar data, file reports, and maintain the appearance of being obedient RAF officer who doesn't ask uncomfortable questions. The archive is yours now. Add to it, preserve it, but don't draw attention to it. And if something happens, if the evidence becomes undeniable or the situation changes, you'll know what to do with it. And if nothing happens, Carter pressed, if I spend the next 20 years collecting evidence that never sees daylight. Kane thought about the metallic object that had hovered over Berlin, about the radar systems that mysteriously malfunctioned whenever something significant appeared, about the institutional machinery designed to maintain ignorance in the face of impossible truth. Then at least someone will know, he said finally. Someone will have documented what really happened in Berlin during those cold years when the world balanced on the edge of annihilation, and something else watched us with patient interest. That might not seem like much, Lieutenant, but in the long run, it could be everything. They shook hands. Two intelligence officers who had briefly glimpsed truth beyond official doctrine and now returned to their respective shadows. Kane left Berlin 3 days later, watching the divided city recede through the airplane window and wondering if he'd ever learn the full story of what had been observing Tempelhof. Years would pass. The Cold War would eventually end. The wall would fall, and Berlin would be reunited. Carter would continue her career, retiring eventually with commendations and a reputation for meticulous documentation. The archive would grow, filled with incidents and anomalies that never made official records. And somewhere in classified files that would remain sealed for decades, evidence of the Berlin radar blackout would wait for the day when humanity might be ready to face the implications. Agent Walter Kane spent his final years at Langley analyzing historical data, writing reports that nobody read, watching his career wind down in bureaucratic obscurity. He never spoke publicly about what he'd witnessed in Berlin, never violated the classification protocols that bound him to silence. But in his private moments, he would sometimes look up at the night sky and wonder what was up there looking back. The truth about the Berlin incidents would eventually emerge, pieces of it anyway, through declassification processes and freedom of information requests filed decades after the events. But by then, the people who had witnessed the incidents firsthand would be dead or too old for their testimony to carry weight. The evidence would be dismissed as Cold War paranoia, misidentification of conventional phenomena, the kind of stories that emerge from any secret program when documents are finally released. But for those who took the time to read the reports carefully, who cross-referenced the dates and patterns, who noticed that similar incidents occurred at military installations around the world during the same period, a different picture emerged. Not proof, never quite proof, but suggestion. Implication. The shadow of something that had been present during humanity's most dangerous moments, observing with patience that transcended human timescales. The Berlin radar blackout was one incident among many, but it was documented by people who refused to accept easy explanations, who preserved evidence despite institutional pressure to forget, who understood that truth has value even when it remains hidden. And in the archives that Lieutenant Helena Carter maintained throughout her career, collected with the careful precision of someone who knew the documents might be humanity's only record of events that officially never occurred, that truth survived. Whether it would ever matter, whether anyone would ever care that something impossible had visited Berlin during those tense Cold War years, remained uncertain. But the evidence existed. The testimony survived. And someday, when the world was ready to ask questions that had no comfortable answers, the truth about what had watched over divided Berlin would be waiting in those archives, patient and undeniable. During my assignment in Berlin, I documented numerous incidents that defy conventional explanation. Radar systems experienced systematic failures coinciding with sightings of unidentified aerial phenomena. Data records were corrupted or altered through means that exceed known technical capabilities. Multiple trained observers witnessed events that violate fundamental principles of aerodynamics and physics. The official explanation, equipment malfunction, is demonstrably insufficient. The pattern of incidents, their timing relative to geopolitical tensions, and the sophisticated methods used to obscure evidence suggest deliberate action by an intelligence with capabilities far exceeding any known nation-state. I believe we are being observed by something that understands our technology, anticipates our responses, and has successfully maintained a decades-long surveillance program without official acknowledgement. Whether this represents extraterrestrial intelligence, time travelers, or some other phenomenon beyond current scientific understanding, I cannot determine. What I can state with certainty is that the truth exists in the archives Lieutenant Carter and I maintained. Future analysts with access to these records may draw their own conclusions. I hope they prove wiser than my generation, which chose comfortable denial over uncomfortable truth. Have you ever seen something that physics says can't exist? Not a trick of the light or a mistaken perception, but something that violates the fundamental rules of how reality works. The kind of thing that makes scientists tear up their textbooks and start over? In August 1974, at a classified test facility in the Nevada desert, 2 men witnessed exactly that, and within 24 hours, one of them was gone, transferred to a post on the other side of the world with orders never to speak of what he'd seen. This is the story they buried until now. Groom Lake, in the summer of 1974, was hell with a security clearance. Temperatures regularly hit 115 degrees, turning the desert into a shimmering oven where mirages danced on the horizon and the air itself seemed to burn. The facility, known to the handful of people cleared to know it existed as Site 4, was home to some of the most advanced aeronautical testing in the world. Stealth technology, exotic propulsion systems, aircraft that wouldn't officially exist for another decade. All of it happened in the restricted airspace above the Nevada Test and Training Range. Major Leo Donovan had been flying experimental aircraft for the Air Force for 12 years. He'd survived 3 ejections, 2 crash landings, and more near-death experiences than he cared to count. Test pilots lived on the edge of human capability, pushing machines and themselves to the breaking point to find out where the limits were. It was dangerous work, but Donovan thrived on it. He understood that every flight could be his last, and he'd made peace with that reality long ago. Sergeant Frank Voss was a different breed of Air Force personnel. He didn't fly, didn't want to fly, and considered pilots to be a special category of crazy that normal people should avoid. But as a radar systems specialist with a doctorate in electrical engineering that he'd earned on the military's dime, Voss was one of the best in the business at making sense of the electromagnetic chaos that modern warfare generated. He could read a radar screen the way poets read verse, finding meaning in patterns that others dismissed as noise. The 2 men had worked together for 8 months, developing a professional respect that bordered on friendship. Donovan trusted Voss to give him accurate data during test flights, and Voss trusted Donovan not to do anything so stupid that it would get them both killed. In the classified world of experimental aviation, that kind of trust was worth more than gold. August 12th started like any other test day. Donovan arrived at the briefing room at 0500 hours for pre-flight review of the day's mission parameters. They were testing a new radar-absorbent coating on a modified F-4 Phantom, seeing how well the material performed under various flight conditions. It was routine work by Site 4 standards. the kind of incremental improvement that didn't make headlines but advanced the state-of-the-art one small step at a time. The briefing was standard: weather conditions, flight envelope parameters, emergency procedures, radio frequencies. Donovan had heard it all 1,000 times before, but he listened with the attention that kept test pilots alive. The meteorologist warned of temperature inversions at altitude, atmospheric conditions that could create visual distortions. Donovan made a mental note but wasn't concerned. He'd flown through worse. By 0630, Donovan was strapped into the cockpit of the modified Phantom, running through his pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. The aircraft had been painted in a matte black coating that absorbed radar waves like a sponge drank water. According to the engineers, it should make the plane nearly invisible to enemy radar. Donovan's job was to find out if the theory matched reality. In the radar control center, Sergeant Voss was running his own checklist, calibrating the tracking systems that would monitor Donovan's flight. The facility had multiple radar installations operating on different frequencies, creating overlapping fields of coverage that could track an object from multiple angles simultaneously. It was overkill for a simple test flight, but at Site 4, redundancy was religion. "Control, this is Test Bird 1, Donovan's voice crackled through the radio. "Pre-flight complete, ready for engine start." "Copy, Test Bird 1, responded the tower controller. "You are cleared for engine start. Winds are 270 at 8 knots, temperature 105 degrees, altimeter 29.87. The Phantom's engines roared to life with a sound like controlled thunder. Donovan felt the familiar vibration through his seat as the twin J-79 turbojets spooled up to idle power. He loved this moment, the transition from static machine to living creature of metal and fire. Every flight began with this transformation, this moment when physics and engineering conspired to defy gravity. "Tower, Test Bird 1 is ready to taxi. Test Bird 1, taxi to runway 21, hold short." Donovan guided the Phantom along the T-sway, the desert heat creating waves of distortion that made the runway ahead seem to shimmer and dance. He performed his final checks as he waited for takeoff clearance, mind focused on the mission ahead. It was supposed to be a simple flight: climb to 40,000 feet, perform a series of standard maneuvers while the radar systems tracked his aircraft's signature, then return for landing. 3 hours, maybe 4. Home in time for lunch. "Test Bird 1, you are cleared for takeoff, runway 21. Climb and maintain flight level 400, heading 090. Cleared for takeoff, Test Bird 1. Donovan advanced the throttles, feeling the Phantom surge forward as 40,000 pounds of thrust pushed him back into his seat. The runway numbers blurred past, the nose wheel lifted, and then he was airborne, climbing into the harsh Nevada morning with the sun painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. In the radar center, Voss watched his screens as the Phantom's signature appeared, then began to fade as the aircraft gained altitude. "Test Bird 1, this is radar control. I have you on scope, signal strength decreasing as expected. The coating is performing well. You're reading about 60% lower than a standard F4 at this altitude." "Copy, radar control. Continuing climb to 40,000. The test proceeded normally for the first 90 minutes. Donovan put the Phantom through a series of predetermined maneuvers: banks, climbs, descents, turns at various G-loads, while Voss tracked him from multiple angles, documenting how the radar-absorbent coating performed under different aspects and flight conditions. The data was good, exactly what the engineers had hoped for. The coating worked, and it worked well. At 0815 hours, with the Phantom cruising at 42,000 feet in a racetrack pattern over the restricted range, something changed. Donovan noticed it first, a flicker of light at the edge of his vision, up and to the right. He turned his head to look, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. There was something in the sky above him. Not another aircraft. Nothing that simple. It looked like a reflection, as if someone had taken a giant mirror and positioned it in the sky. He could see himself, see his own aircraft reflected back at him with perfect clarity, hanging motionless in the air roughly 5,000 feet above his position. But the reflection was wrong. His aircraft was in level flight, but the reflection showed the Phantom inverted, flying upside down, as if he was looking at himself through a mirror that had been flipped on its axis. Radar control, test bird 1. I have a visual anomaly at my 12 o'clock high, approximately 5,000 feet above my position. Appears to be some kind of atmospheric reflection or mirage. Can you confirm any contacts in that area? In the control center, Voss frowned at his screens. Test bird 1, negative. I show no contacts within 50 miles of your position except your own aircraft. What are you seeing up there? I'm seeing a reflection of my own aircraft, Sergeant. Clear as day, but inverted. Like looking in a mirror that's been flipped upside down. The atmospheric conditions must be creating some kind of superior mirage effect. Voss pulled up weather data, looking for the temperature inversions that could create such phenomena. Mirages weren't uncommon in the desert, but at 40,000 feet the conditions were different. The air was thin, cold, too stable for the kind of thermal layering that created ground-level illusions. But before he could formulate a response, every radar screen in the control center went haywire. Contacts appeared and disappeared across the displays, ghost returns that flickered in and out of existence with no apparent pattern. Signal strengths fluctuated wildly, readings jumping from minimal to maximum and back again within seconds. And then, in the center of the chaos, a single, solid return appeared directly above Donovan's position. The contact was large, easily the size of a commercial airliner, and it was holding absolutely still at 47,000 feet. Test bird 1, I'm picking up a contact above your position, Voss reported, his professional calm masking rising confusion. Bearing 090, range 5,000 feet, altitude 47,000. But Major, the return signature is impossible. I'm reading negative altitude separation. Say again, radar control? Donovan's voice carried a note of uncertainty. Did you say negative altitude separation? Affirmative, test bird 1. The contact is reading as being below you in altitude while simultaneously being above you spatially. The depth measurement is negative. Major, that's physically impossible. Distance can't have a negative value in three-dimensional space. Donovan's mind raced, trying to make sense of what Voss was telling him. Negative depth meant something was both in front of and behind him at the same time, occupying space in a way that violated basic geometry. It was like saying something was north and south of you simultaneously. The words had meaning individually, but made no sense when combined. Radar control. I still have a clear visual on the reflection. It's not moving, just holding position above me. But I'm going to tell you something that's going to sound crazy. It's not a reflection of where I am now. Look at my heading indicator. Voss checked the telemetry data streaming from Donovan's aircraft. You're on heading 090, test bird 1. Right, but the reflection is showing my aircraft on a heading of 270. Sergeant, that reflection is showing me flying in the exact opposite direction from my actual flight path. Whatever that thing is, it's not following normal optical laws. The implications settled over Voss like a cold weight. Reflections showed mirror images, but they always corresponded to the object's actual orientation relative to the reflecting surface. A reflection that showed contradictory heading information wasn't a reflection at all. It was something else, something that suggested the laws of physics were being bent or broken in ways that shouldn't be possible. Test bird 1, recommend you maintain current heading and altitude. I'm going to bring additional radar systems online to get multiple tracking solutions on this contact. Copy, radar control, maintaining current parameters. Voss worked quickly, activating backup radar installations that normally remained offline during routine tests. Within seconds, multiple independent systems were tracking the anomaly, and each one confirmed what the primary radar had shown. There was something at 47,000 feet directly above Donovan's position, and it was generating a return signature that defied rational explanation. The negative depth reading persisted across all systems. Whatever was up there existed in a spatial relationship to Donovan's aircraft that didn't conform to Euclidean geometry. It was as if something had punctured reality, creating a fold or discontinuity in three-dimensional space that allowed an object to be in two places or orientations simultaneously. Major, I'm confirming the anomaly on multiple independent systems, Voss reported, keeping his voice level despite the growing sense that they were witnessing something unprecedented. All readings are consistent. Whatever that thing is, it's real, it's solid, and it's violating fundamental principles of spatial geometry. Sir, I think you should consider breaking off the test and returning to base. Donovan's first instinct was to agree. Test pilots were trained to recognize when a situation was deteriorating and take action before it became critical. But he was also a man of intense curiosity, and what he was seeing represented an opportunity that might never come again. An opportunity to observe something that science said couldn't exist. Negative, radar control. I'm going to maintain position for observation. This is too significant to abandon without proper documentation. Are you recording all of this? Affirmative, Test Bird 1. All radar data is being recorded to tape. We're getting every detail. Voss hesitated, then added, Major, whatever this is, it's beyond my experience or training. I don't have a frame of reference for what we're seeing. Join the club, Sergeant. I'm looking right at it, and I don't believe it either. For the next 7 minutes, Donovan held position while Voss documented the phenomenon from every angle the radar systems could provide. The reflection remained constant, showing the inverted image of the phantom flying on a reciprocal heading. The radar returns continued to show negative depth, a measurement that shouldn't exist, but was being recorded by multiple independent systems with different operating principles and frequencies. And then, without warning, it was simply gone. The reflection vanished, as if someone had switched it off, leaving only empty sky where the impossible image had been. On Voss's screens, the anomalous contact disappeared simultaneously, the radar returns dropping to nothing between one sweep and the next. The negative depth reading ceased, the electromagnetic chaos that had accompanied the phenomenon faded, and the sky returned to normal. Radar control, Test Bird 1. The anomaly has disappeared. I no longer have visual contact, and I'm reading negative on all instruments. Did you see it depart on radar? Voss stared at his displays, replaying the last few seconds of recorded data. Negative, Test Bird 1. It didn't depart. It just ceased to exist. One moment it was there, solid return across all frequencies. The next moment, nothing. No fade, no gradual disappearance, no movement away from your position. It was there, and then it wasn't. Donovan felt a chill, despite the desert heat beating through the canopy. Things didn't just disappear from radar. They moved away, descended below the radar horizon, or were masked by terrain. But objects didn't vanish from multiple tracking systems simultaneously unless they were deliberately using electronic countermeasures. And even then, there were signatures, artifacts, evidence of jamming or spoofing. This had been clean disappearance, absolute and complete. Test Bird 1, recommend you return to base. We need to analyze this data while it's fresh. And, Major, I think this is going to require briefing higher command. What we just documented isn't going to stay at our level. Agreed, radar control. Test Bird 1 is RTB, requesting direct vector to initial approach. The flight back to Groom Lake was uneventful, but Donovan's mind churned with questions. He'd seen enough classified projects to know that the government was developing technology that would seem like magic to the public. Stealth aircraft, advanced sensors, electronic warfare systems that could make things appear or disappear from radar screens. But this had been different. This had involved a visual phenomenon that corresponded with impossible radar data, and no known technology could create that combination. After landing and securing the aircraft, Donovan headed straight to the radar control center. He found Voss hunched over the recorded data, running it through analysis programs and trying to make sense of measurements that violated basic physics. The sergeant looked up when Donovan entered, his expression a mixture of excitement and fear. "Major, I've gone through the data 3 times. Every system confirms the same thing. For 7 minutes and 43 seconds, there was something in the sky above you that generated a solid radar return while simultaneously measuring at negative depth relative to your position. And the visual observation you reported matches perfectly with what the radar data suggests, an object that appeared to be in 2 orientational states at once." Donovan pulled up a chair, studying the radar plots that Voss had printed out. The data was clear, methodical, unambiguous. They hadn't hallucinated or misinterpreted normal phenomena. They'd witnessed and documented something genuinely anomalous. "What's the protocol for this?" Donovan asked. "I've reported plenty of unusual events during test flights, but nothing like this. Do we go straight to the base commander?" Voss nodded slowly. "Protocol says any unexplained aerial phenomenon that might represent foreign technology gets reported through intelligence channels. But Major, this doesn't feel like foreign technology. The Russians are good, but they're not this good. Nobody is this good. What we documented suggests capabilities that are decades beyond anything I've seen in classified briefings." "Then what do you think it was?" Donovan asked, voicing the question that neither of them wanted to address directly. Voss was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I think we saw something that exists outside the normal framework of physics as we understand it. Whether that's extraterrestrial technology, something from a parallel dimension, or a natural phenomenon we don't have the science to explain yet, I can't say, but Major, one thing I'm certain of, this is going to get buried. The moment we report this up the chain, people with security clearances we don't even know exist are going to descend on this data, and we're going to be told to forget we ever saw it." Donovan knew Voss was probably right. But protocol was protocol. Within the hour, they'd prepared a preliminary report and requested an emergency briefing with Colonel Harrison, the Site 4 commander. Harrison was a career officer who'd spent 30 years in the Air Force, and he'd seen enough classified projects to maintain his composure when presented with unusual information. But as he read through the radar data and listened to Donovan's first-hand account, even Harrison's professional mask slipped. "You're telling me that for nearly 8 minutes you observed a visual phenomenon that corresponded with radar returns showing negative spatial depth?" Harrison's voice was carefully neutral, but his eyes betrayed his disbelief. "Major, you understand how this sounds." "Yes, sir, I do," Donovan replied. "Which is why we have the radar data. Multiple independent systems, all showing the same impossible readings. Whatever I saw up there, it wasn't a hallucination or equipment malfunction. It was real, it was documented, and it represents something we can't explain with current physics." Harrison turned to Voss. "Sergeant, walk me through the technical details. I need to understand exactly what the radar systems recorded." For the next 20 minutes, Voss presented a detailed analysis of the radar data, explaining how negative depth measurements violated fundamental principles of 3-dimensional geometry. He showed Harrison the correlation between the visual observation and the electromagnetic signatures, demonstrating that whatever had appeared in the sky had been both optically and electromagnetically present. It wasn't a reflection, wasn't an artifact, wasn't a glitch. It was a genuine phenomenon that defied categorization. When Voss finished, Harrison sat in silence for a long moment, studying the data printouts spread across his desk. Finally, he looked up with an expression that combined resignation and concern. "Gentlemen, I'm going to be honest with you. This is beyond my authority to handle. I'm required to report this through AFOSI channels immediately. Air Force Office of Special Investigations deals with incidents that might represent unknown technology or security threats. They'll send a team to debrief you, examine the evidence, and make a determination about classification and further action." "When should we expect them, sir?" Donovan asked. "They're probably already on their way," Harrison replied grimly. "The moment I flag something as potential unknown aerial phenomena, it triggers automatic notifications to multiple agencies. Major, Sergeant, until AFOSI arrives and completes their investigation, you're both confined to base. No outside communication. No discussing this incident with anyone who wasn't directly involved. Is that understood?" They both nodded, though Donovan felt the first stirrings of unease. Confined to base meant they were being isolated, cut off from external contact. It was standard procedure for security incidents, but it also meant they were at the mercy of whatever investigation was about to descend on them. The AFOSE team arrived 6 hours later. 3 men in civilian clothes who carried themselves with the quiet authority of people accustomed to operating in shadows. The lead investigator introduced himself as Mr. Sterling, offering no first name or rank. His companions remained silent, setting up recording equipment and securing the radar control center while Sterling conducted individual interviews. Donovan went first, spending 2 hours walking Sterling through every detail of the flight. The investigator's questions were precise, probing, designed to find inconsistencies or evidence of misinterpretation. But Donovan's account remained consistent because it was true. He'd seen what he'd seen, and no amount of skeptical questioning would change that reality. Sterling's expression betrayed nothing as he listened, taking detailed notes and occasionally asking for clarification. When Donovan finished, Sterling closed his notebook and fixed him with a steady gaze. "Major Donovan, I need to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you discussed this incident with anyone outside the immediate chain of command? Family, friends, anyone at all?" "No, sir. Colonel Harrison's orders were clear. I haven't spoken to anyone except Sergeant Voss and the Colonel himself." "Good. Keep it that way. What you witnessed is now classified at the highest level. You won't speak of it. You won't write about it. You won't even think about it in contexts where you might accidentally reveal information. Do you understand?" "I understand the classification requirements," Donovan replied carefully. "But I'd like to know what you think we encountered up there. If this represents foreign technology or some kind of threat, what it represents is above your clearance level," Sterling interrupted. "Your job was to fly the aircraft and report what you saw. You've done that. The rest is not your concern." The dismissal was clear, but Donovan pressed anyway. "With respect, sir, I was the pilot in command during this incident. I have a need to know if there's a threat to flight safety that could affect future operations." Sterling's eyes hardened. "Major, let me be very clear. What you witnessed falls under a special access program that you are not read into and will not be read into. The radar data has been secured. Your report will be classified and filed appropriately. And you will return to normal duties with the understanding that this incident never happened. That's not a suggestion. That's an order from authority that supersedes your chain of command. Are we clear?" Donovan felt anger rising but suppressed it. He'd spent enough time in the military to recognize when pushing back would accomplish nothing except damaging his career. "Crystal clear, sir." Voss's interview followed a similar pattern, though Sterling seemed particularly interested in the technical details of the radar returns. The investigator spent extra time questioning Voss about the negative depth readings, clearly trying to determine if there was any possibility of equipment malfunction or misinterpretation. But Voss's expertise was unassailable. The data was solid, the measurements were accurate, and the phenomenon had been real. After the interviews concluded, Sterling and his team spent another 4 hours examining the radar equipment, pulling tapes, and documenting everything related to the incident. They worked with efficient precision, speaking to each other in technical jargon that Donovan couldn't follow. Finally, as the sun was setting over the Nevada desert, Sterling emerged from the control center with a locked case containing all the physical evidence. "Colonel Harrison, Major Donovan, Sergeant Voss," Sterling said formally. "The investigation is complete. All evidence has been secured and will be transferred to appropriate facilities for analysis. The incident is now classified under Special Access Program protocols. Each of you will sign non-disclosure agreements acknowledging your understanding of the classification requirements and the consequences of unauthorized disclosure." They signed the documents without protest, though Donovan read the fine print carefully. The consequences for violating the classification were severe: criminal prosecution, loss of clearances, potential imprisonment. The government was taking this very seriously, which in a perverse way validated that what they'd seen was genuinely significant. After Sterling and his team departed, taking all the evidence with them, Harrison called Donovan and Voss into his office. The colonel looked tired, his expression troubled. "I'm going to level with you both. I've been at Site 4 for 6 years, and I've seen a lot of strange things. Experimental aircraft that push the boundaries of physics, classified programs that won't see daylight for decades. But I've never seen a foci move this fast or lock something down this tight. Whatever you encountered up there, it scared someone with a lot of authority." "Sir, do you have any idea what the Special Access Program designation means?" Voss asked. "I've held top-secret clearances for 15 years, and I've never heard of SAP protocols being applied to a radar contact." Harrison shook his head. "Special Access Programs are compartmented beyond normal classification levels. They operate on strict need-to-know basis, and apparently we don't need to know. My guess is that what you documented ties into ongoing research or past incidents that are being kept under deep classification. But that's just speculation. The truth is, we'll probably never know what this was really about." Donovan felt a profound sense of frustration. They'd witnessed something extraordinary, something that challenged a fundamental understanding of physics and reality, and now it was being swept under a classified rug where it would gather dust alongside countless other unexplained incidents. How many other pilots and radar operators had seen similar phenomena, only to be silenced by classification protocols and threatened with prosecution if they spoke out? "What happens now, sir?" Donovan asked. Harrison's expression grew even more troubled. "Major, I received orders an hour ago. You're being transferred to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, effective immediately. You'll be ferrying aircraft for the Pacific Air Force's standard rotation duty. Your replacement arrives tomorrow, and you ship out the day after." The words hit Donovan like a physical blow. Transferred within 24 hours of filing the report, shipped halfway around the world to a posting that would remove him from any proximity to classified test programs. It was a textbook example of how the military dealt with people who'd seen things they shouldn't have. Relocate them, isolate them, and make sure they couldn't follow up on what they'd witnessed. "Sir, with respect, that's a punishment posting disguised as routine rotation, I've been at Site 4 for 3 years and my tour isn't scheduled to end for another 18 months. This is retaliation for reporting what I saw. This is following orders, Major," Harrison said firmly, though his eyes conveyed sympathy. "I don't make these decisions. Someone above my pay grade decided you need to be somewhere else, and arguing about it will only make things worse. Take the posting, keep your head down, and maybe in a few years this will blow over and you can return to test work." Donovan knew Harrison was right, but that didn't make it easier to accept. He'd dedicated his career to pushing the boundaries of aviation, and now he was being exiled for doing exactly what protocol required, reporting an anomaly that could represent a threat or breakthrough. The injustice burned, but he was professional enough to recognize when a battle was lost before it began. "And Sergeant Voss?" Donovan asked. "Sergeant Voss will remain at Site 4 in his current position," Harrison replied. "Though I suspect he'll be working on projects that have nothing to do with advanced radar systems for the foreseeable future." After leaving Harrison's office, Donovan found Voss in the radar control center, staring at empty screens that no longer held the impossible data they'd recorded just hours earlier. The sergeant looked up when Donovan entered, and didn't need to be told what had happened. He could read it in Donovan's expression. "They're transferring you," Voss stated flatly. "Kadena. Day after tomorrow. Apparently, the Pacific Air Forces desperately need experienced ferry pilots, and my particular skills are required immediately." Donovan's voice dripped with bitter irony. Voss was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "Major, I made a copy. Before Sterling's team arrived, I duplicated the radar tapes to a backup system that's not on the official equipment inventory. It's hidden, secure, and completely deniable. If anyone asks, those tapes don't exist. But they do exist, and they'll stay hidden until either the truth comes out or I'm too old to care about the consequences anymore." Donovan felt a surge of gratitude mixed with concern. What Voss had done was technically treason, violation of classification protocols that could send him to Leavenworth for decades. But it was also an act of integrity, preserving evidence that powerful forces wanted erased from history. "Sergeant, if they find out, they won't find out," Voss interrupted. "I've been working with classified systems long enough to know how to hide things in plain sight. The tapes are safe, and they'll stay safe. And Major, someday when the classification expires or circumstances change, that evidence will prove we weren't crazy. That what we saw was real." Donovan extended his hand, and Voss shook it firmly. They both knew this was goodbye, that their paths were unlikely to cross again in what remained of their careers, but they'd shared something significant. A moment when reality had revealed itself to be stranger and more complex than official doctrine allowed. That shared experience created a bond that transcended rank and circumstance. "Good luck in Okinawa, Major. Try not to see any more impossible things. Good luck here, Sergeant, and thank you for being a witness I could trust." The next 36 hours passed in a blur of out-processing, packing, and preparing for sudden relocation. Donovan's replacement arrived, a competent pilot who asked no questions about why he was filling a slot that shouldn't have been vacant. The Site 4 community treated Donovan's departure as routine, though he noticed how people avoided discussing the circumstances. Everyone knew something had happened, but nobody wanted to be associated with whatever trouble had caused a valued test pilot to be shipped overseas on 12 hours' notice. On his final evening at Groom Lake, Donovan stood outside his quarters, looking up at the night sky. The stars burned with desert clarity, countless points of light representing distances and scales that dwarfed human concerns. Somewhere up there, perhaps in orbit, perhaps in dimensions that physics didn't acknowledge, something had chosen to appear in the sky above Nevada for 8 minutes. It had shown itself to 2 witnesses, allowed itself to be documented, and then vanished as if it had never existed. Why? That was the question that haunted Donovan. If the phenomenon was natural, some quirk of atmospheric physics that science hadn't yet explained, then why the immediate classification and suppression? Natural phenomena didn't warrant special access program protocols. But if it was technology, whether foreign, domestic, or something else entirely, then why reveal it at all? Why allow witnesses and documentation? Unless, Donovan thought, the revelation was intentional. Unless whoever or whatever had created the mirror effect in the sky wanted it documented, wanted evidence preserved, wanted witnesses who could testify to impossible physics. Maybe the classification and suppression were reactions by human authorities trying to maintain control over information. But the original phenomenon had been designed to bypass that control. It was a disturbing thought, suggesting layers of manipulation that extended beyond military compartmentation into realms of intent and purpose that Donovan couldn't fathom. But it made a certain sense. If something wanted to gradually acclimate humanity to the reality of phenomena beyond conventional physics, occasional glimpses that were seen but officially denied would be a logical approach. Plant seeds of truth in the minds of witnesses. Let those seeds germinate over decades, and eventually the accumulated weight of testimony would overcome institutional denial. Or maybe he was overthinking it. Maybe it had been exactly what Sterling and the AFOC team wanted him to believe. An anomaly, a glitch, something that could be explained away by atmospheric conditions and equipment artifacts. Maybe in 10 years, he'd look back on this incident and wonder if his own memories were reliable. But Donovan didn't think so. He knew what he'd seen. The image of his own aircraft reflected an impossible orientation, showing contradictory flight data, existing in a spatial relationship that violated the laws of three-dimensional geometry. That wasn't something he would forget or doubt. And somewhere in a hidden archive, Sergeant Voss's backup tapes preserved proof that it had been real. The transport to Okinawa departed at 0600 hours. Donovan took one last look at the desert facility that had been his home for 3 years, then boarded the aircraft that would carry him away from classified work and toward a mundane assignment ferrying planes around the Pacific Theater. It was the end of one chapter and the beginning of another, though he suspected the story of Operation Mirror was far from over. Years would pass. Donovan would complete his tour in Okinawa, serve in other capacities, eventually retire from the Air Force with commendations and a pension. He would never speak publicly about what he'd witnessed that August day in 1974, honoring the classification protocols he'd signed. But in private moments, in conversations with people he trusted, he would hint at truths that official history denied. And those hints would add to the accumulated testimony of others who'd seen similar impossible things. Sergeant Voss would remain at Site 4 for another decade, working on various classified projects, but never again encountering phenomena like the mirror effect. He would retire eventually, taking his secrets and his hidden evidence with him. The backup tapes would remain secure, waiting for a time when their revelation might matter. Whether that time would come in his lifetime remained uncertain, but Voss was patient. Truth had a way of surviving, even when buried under layers of classification and denial. The official record of Operation Mirror would remain sealed, filed away in archives that required special clearances and need-to-know justification to access. The incident report would be sanitized, stripped of its most significant details, reduced to a footnote about atmospheric phenomena and equipment anomalies. Anyone stumbling across it decades later would find nothing to suggest that anything unusual had occurred. But the truth existed, in memories, in hidden backup tapes, in the documented but classified testimony of witnesses who knew what they'd seen, and perhaps most significantly, in the phenomenon itself, whatever it was wherever it came from, which had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded human technology by margins that suggested either vast temporal advancement or fundamentally different approaches to physics and reality. The mirror in the sky had appeared once. Had it appeared before? Would it appear again? Those questions had no official answers, would probably never have official answers. But they were questions that needed to be asked, phenomena that needed to be studied, truths that needed to be acknowledged. Until that day came, if it ever did, the incident would remain what it was: a classified memory, a hidden truth, a piece of a larger puzzle that humanity was only beginning to recognize existed. The Cold War would continue. Conventional explanations would be maintained, and life would go on as if the laws of physics were settled and understood. But they weren't. Operation Mirror had proven that. And somewhere in the classified archives of military intelligence, evidence of that proof waited for the day when humanity might be ready to face the implications.